Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. What you're about to hear will make you think twice about taking shortcuts across frozen lakes in the dead of winter. This is a true account from a trucker who learned that some ice roads were abandoned for reasons that have nothing to do with safety regulations. Abner Coldwell had been driving the northern routes for 11 years when he made the decision that would change everything he thought he knew about the Minnesota wilderness. It was February 2023, and Abner was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Duluth to a mining operation near Ely, running about 3 hours behind schedule due to a mechanical delay at the loading dock. The temperature had dropped to minus 18 degrees, and a light snow was making the main highways treacherous enough that most sensible drivers were pulling over to wait out the worst of it. Abner wasn't most drivers. He had a reputation in the Iron Range territory for delivering on time no matter what the weather threw at him, and he wasn't about to let a little snow ruin his perfect record. Besides, he knew these roads better than he knew the layout of his own house. Every truck stop, every steep grade, every tight turn between Duluth and Ely was mapped in his mind with the kind of detail that only comes from years of repetition. That confidence is what led him to consider the shortcut. There was an old ice road that ran across Lake Vermilion, a route that the local iron ore trucks had used back in the 70s and 80s when the mining operations were at their peak. The road had been officially closed for over 20 years, deemed too dangerous for modern truck traffic due to unpredictable ice conditions and the increasing warmth of winter temperatures. But Abner had heard stories from old-timers at the truck stops, men who swore that the ice road could cut 40 miles off the journey and save nearly 2 hours of driving time. 2 hours was exactly what Abner needed to make his delivery window. He made the turn onto the access road just past the small town of Tower, following a path that was barely visible under the fresh snow. The road wound through dense pine forest for about 3 miles before opening up onto the frozen expanse of Lake Vermilion. In the darkness, with only his headlights cutting through the falling snow, the lake looked like an endless white plain that stretched to the horizon. There were signs at the lake access point, faded and weathered but still readable in the beam of Abner's flashlight when he stopped to check them. Warning: ice road closed. Unsafe conditions. No truck traffic permitted. The signs were dated 2001, which meant they'd been there for over 2 decades. Abner stood in the freezing wind considering his options. The ice had to be at least 3 feet thick by now, more than enough to support his loaded truck. The cold snap had been going on for 2 solid weeks, and he hadn't heard of any unusual thaws or warm spells that might have weakened the surface. Abner made his decision. He climbed back into his cab, checked his fuel gauge and engine temperature, and began the slow journey across the frozen lake. The ice road was marked by old wooden stakes that had been driven into the ice decades ago, most of them leaning at odd angles or missing entirely. Abner followed the general direction they indicated, keeping his speed down to about 15 miles per hour and listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate stress or cracking in the ice below. The truck's weight settled onto the frozen surface with a series of deep, groaning sounds that made Abner's jaw clench. But the ice held firm, and he pressed forward into the darkness. The snow was falling heavier now, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet in front of the truck. Abner's headlights reflected off the swirling flakes, creating a hypnotic effect that made it difficult to judge distance or maintain a straight course. He relied on his compass and the occasional landmark, a small island here, a distinctive rock formation there, to keep himself oriented in the white void. About 20 minutes into the crossing, Abner saw the first light. It appeared off to his left, maybe a quarter-mile away across the ice. At first, Abner thought it might be a fish house, one of those small ice fishing shelters that locals dragged out onto frozen lakes during the winter season. But the light was wrong for that. It was too bright, too steady, and it had a bluish quality that reminded Abner of the mercury vapor lights they used in parking lots and industrial yards. Abner slowed his truck and watched the light for several minutes. It didn't move, didn't flicker, just maintained that steady blue glow against the darkness and falling snow. Something about it made Abner uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite define. It wasn't the light itself, but rather the wrongness of its existence out here in the middle of a frozen lake in the middle of a snowstorm. He decided to ignore it and continue on his route. But as he drove, more lights appeared. First one, then two, then half a dozen scattered across the ice at irregular intervals. All of them had that same blue glow, all of them unnaturally steady despite the wind and snow. Abner counted 9 lights in total, arranged in what might have been a pattern if you looked at them from the right angle. The lights reminded Abner of something, a memory that took him several minutes to place. Back in the 80s, when the ice road was still in regular use, the mining companies had installed emergency lights along the route. They were powered by some kind of experimental battery system that was supposed to last for decades, providing navigation markers for trucks making the crossing and poor visibility. But those lights had been removed when the ice road was officially closed, hadn't they? Abner couldn't remember hearing anything about them still being out here. As Abner approached the rough midpoint of the crossing, his truck's headlights illuminated something that made him press the brake pedal harder than he intended. The truck slowed with a groan of metal and a protest from the ice below, but Abner barely noticed. His attention was fixed on what he was seeing through the windshield. There was a fish house directly in his path, maybe 100 feet ahead. But it wasn't like any fish house Abner had ever seen. The structure was old, built from weathered plywood and 2x4s that looked like they'd been sitting out in the elements for years. The roof was partially collapsed, and the single small window was dark and empty. What made the sight disturbing was the condition of everything around the fish house. The snow around the structure was pristine and undisturbed, showing no tire tracks, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had visited this location in weeks or possibly months. But the door of the fish house was standing open, swinging slightly in the wind, and Abner could see that the interior was dark except for a faint blue glow that might have been reflected light from one of those mysterious markers. Abner stopped his truck completely, the engine idling in the stillness. He sat there for several minutes, watching the fish house and trying to decide whether what he was seeing made any sense. Ice fishermen were fanatics about their shelters. They didn't just abandon them out on the ice to deteriorate. And even if someone had left this structure behind, the open door was wrong. Nobody left a fish house door open in this kind of weather unless they were actively using it. That's when Abner heard the sound. It came from beneath his truck, a deep, resonant thud that seemed to travel through the ice and up through the frame of his vehicle. The sound was followed by another thud, then another, creating a slow rhythm that reminded Abner of someone knocking on a door from the inside. The thuds weren't random. They had a pattern, a deliberate quality that suggested intent rather than natural ice movement. Abner's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd driven across frozen lakes before, and he was familiar with the sounds that ice made as it expanded and contracted in the cold. This wasn't that. This was something hitting the underside of the ice, something that was apparently following his truck and announcing its presence with those deliberate, rhythmic impacts. The CB radio crackled to life without warning, making Abner jump in his seat. Static filled the cab, punctuated by what might have been voices or might have been interference from the storm. Abner reached for the radio and cycled through the channels, but every frequency carried the same distorted static. He was about to turn the radio off when a voice emerged from the noise, faint but unmistakable. Coldwell, Abner Coldwell. The voice was male, rough and distorted like someone speaking through a damaged speaker. It knew his name. Abner's first instinct was to respond, but something made him hesitate. The voice didn't sound quite right. There was a quality to it that reminded him of recordings played backward, or voices heard through water. "You shouldn't be on this ice, Coldwell. This road was closed for a reason." Abner grabbed his CB microphone. "This is Coldwell. Who is this? How do you know my name?" The static intensified, then cleared enough for the voice to come through again. "Names don't matter out here anymore. What matters is that you're crossing over places that should stay buried. The ice keeps secrets, Coldwell. 23 winters of secrets." Before Abner could respond, the thuds from beneath his truck resumed, louder now and more insistent. The rhythm had changed, becoming faster and more aggressive. It sounded like multiple sources now, as if several things were hitting the ice from below in a coordinated pattern. The ice beneath Abner's truck groaned in response, a sound that made his stomach clench with sudden fear. Abner made a decision. He put the truck in gear and began moving forward again, steering around the abandoned fish house and continuing toward what he hoped was the far shore. The thuds followed him, maintaining their position directly below his truck as he drove. Every few seconds, the impacts would create visible ripples in the snow that had accumulated on the ice, circular patterns that spread out from beneath his vehicle like sonar pings. The blue lights were all around him now, creating an eerie corridor through the darkness. As Abner drove past each light, he could see that they were mounted on metal posts that had been driven through the ice. The posts were old and rusted, and several of them were tilted at dangerous angles as if something had tried to pull them down. At the base of each post, the ice had a strange quality. It was darker than the surrounding surface, almost black, and it had a texture that reminded Abner of glass that had been shattered and then frozen solid again. Abner's headlights caught movement ahead, and he instinctively hit the brakes. There was something on the ice, directly in his path. At first, Abner thought it was another fish house, or maybe a snowdrift that had formed into an unusual shape. But as his truck came to a stop and his headlights illuminated the object more clearly, Abner felt his mouth go dry. It was a truck, an old semi, probably from the 80s based on the cab design. The vehicle was sitting at an odd angle, listing to one side as if the ice beneath it had partially given way. The truck's trailer was still attached, and Abner could see that it was carrying what looked like mining equipment, the same kind of industrial machinery that was currently sitting in his own trailer. The old truck's paint was faded and peeling, and ice had formed in thick layers across every surface. The windshield was frosted over completely, making it impossible to see inside the cab. But what made Abner's skin crawl was the condition of the scene around the vehicle. Just like the fish house, there were no tracks, no footprints, no evidence of how this truck had gotten here or what had happened to its driver. Abner pulled his truck alongside the abandoned vehicle, keeping a safe distance in case the ice was weak in that area. He grabbed his flashlight from the door pocket and considered getting out to investigate. Every instinct told him this was a bad idea, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. If there was a driver inside that cab, someone who might be injured or in trouble, Abner couldn't just drive away without checking. He opened his door and stepped out onto the ice, immediately feeling the bitter wind cut through his heavy jacket. The temperature had dropped even further, and the wind chill had to be somewhere around -40. Abner's breath came out in white clouds that were whipped away by the wind almost before they formed. He approached the abandoned truck carefully, testing the ice with each step and listening for any sounds of cracking or movement. The abandoned truck's door was unlocked. Abner pulled it open with some effort, the frozen hinges protesting with a shriek of metal on metal. The cab was empty, but it showed signs of recent occupation. There was a coffee thermos in the cup holder, still half full with liquid that had frozen solid. A logbook lay open on the passenger seat, its pages stiff with frost. Most disturbing was the jacket hanging behind the driver's seat, a heavy winter coat that anyone crossing this ice in these temperatures would need. Abner reached for the logbook, his gloved hands clumsy as he tried to turn the frozen pages. He could make out a name written in the header, Thaddeus Pike. The date of the last entry was February 14, 2001. 22 years ago. The entry itself was brief and troubling. Ice condition deteriorating. Hearing sounds from below. Company advised. Proceeding to shore. Abner looked around the empty cab, trying to piece together what had happened here. Pike had made it this far across the ice, had noted problems and reported them to his company, and had decided to continue toward shore rather than turn back. But he'd left his coat behind, which made no sense, and his truck was still here, abandoned in the middle of the lake with no explanation for where the driver had gone. That's when Abner noticed the cracks. They spread out from beneath the abandoned truck in a spiderweb pattern, dark lines in the ice that suggested serious structural weakness. But the cracks weren't natural. They had a geometric quality, almost like they'd been carved into the ice deliberately. And at the center of the pattern, directly beneath the truck's trailer, the ice was different. It was the same dark, shattered appearance that Abner had seen around the blue light posts. A sound made Abner turn back toward his own truck. The thuds had stopped, replaced by something worse. It was a scraping sound like metal being dragged across ice, and it was coming from the direction of his vehicle. Abner's headlights were still on, and in their beam he could see his truck rocking slightly, as if something was pushing against it from below. Abner ran back to his cab, his boots slipping on the smooth ice. He climbed inside and slammed the door, his heart pounding. Through his mirrors, he could see that the ice around his truck was rippling, subtle waves spreading out from beneath his trailer. The scraping sound continued, growing louder, and now Abner could hear what sounded like voices mixed with the noise. Multiple voices, all speaking at once, creating a chorus of sound that was almost but not quite human. The CB radio erupted with activity. The voice from before was back, but now it was joined by others. They were all talking over each other, creating a cacophony that made it impossible to understand individual words. But the tone was clear. They were angry. They were warning him, and they were getting closer. Abner threw his truck into gear and pressed the accelerator, pulling away from the abandoned vehicle. His tires spun for a terrifying moment before finding purchase on the ice. The truck lurched forward, and Abner felt the ice beneath him groan in protest. Behind him, through his mirrors, he could see something happening to Pike's abandoned truck. The ice around the old vehicle was cracking open, dark water welling up through the gaps. The truck was sinking, settling deeper into the compromised ice with a sound like breaking glass. And rising from the cracks, illuminated by Abner's taillights, were shapes that shouldn't exist. They looked almost human, but wrong in ways that Abner's mind refused to fully process. They were the color of ice, translucent and shifting, and they were reaching toward Abner's truck with movements that defied normal physics. Abner focused on driving, keeping his eyes forward and his foot steady on the accelerator. The shore had to be close now. He'd been crossing for almost 40 minutes, and even at reduced speed, he should be near the far side of the lake. The blue lights continued to mark his path, but now they seemed hostile rather than helpful, like they were herding him toward something rather than guiding him to safety. The thuds resumed beneath his truck, but now they were joined by that scraping sound. It felt like something was holding onto his trailer, trying to slow him down or pull him off course. Abner could feel the drag through his steering wheel, the way his truck wanted to pull to the left despite his efforts to keep it straight. The ice groaned and cracked around him, and through his mirrors he could see those shapes following, gliding across the frozen surface with impossible speed. Then, through the falling snow and darkness, Abner saw lights ahead. Real lights. Electric lights from buildings on the shore. He was almost there. The far edge of the lake was maybe 200 yards away, close enough that Abner could make out the details of the small marina and boat launch that marked the end of the ice road. The scraping sound intensified, becoming a shriek of tortured metal. Something was definitely attached to his trailer now, something heavy enough to affect his truck's handling. Abner increased his speed as much as he dared, praying that the ice would hold for just a few more minutes. The shapes behind him were closer now, close enough that Abner could see details he wished he couldn't. They had faces, or something like faces, and in those features Abner thought he recognized human expressions twisted into something unnatural. With a final surge of power, Abner's truck climbed the gentle slope from ice to land. The scraping sound cut off abruptly, replaced by a sound like something large falling into water. Abner didn't slow down. He kept driving, following the access road away from the lake and back toward the main highway. It wasn't until he was 3 miles inland that he finally allowed himself to stop and breathe. Abner sat in his idling truck for several minutes, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. Then he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out to inspect his trailer. What he found made his blood run cold. There were marks on the trailer's undercarriage, deep gouges in the metal that looked like they'd been made by something trying to claw its way inside. The marks were concentrated near the rear of the trailer, and they were still cold to the touch, covered in a thin layer of frost that shouldn't have formed in the short time since he'd left the lake. Abner climbed back into his cab and pulled out his phone. He needed to report what he'd seen. Needed to tell someone about the abandoned truck, and the sounds from beneath the ice, and those shapes that had followed him to shore. But as he started to dial, he noticed something that made him pause. His logbook was open on the passenger seat. He didn't remember opening it, and written in the margins, in handwriting that definitely wasn't his own, was a message. "We're still down there, Coldwell, under the ice, waiting for the next truck that thinks it knows better than the warning signs. 23 of us now, but there's always room for more." Abner Coldwell didn't sleep that night. He made his delivery to the mining operation near Ely right on schedule, unloaded the equipment with shaking hands, and accepted his paperwork from a foreman who asked him twice if everything was all right. Abner said he was fine, just tired from the drive, and climbed back into his cab as soon as the trailer was empty. He needed to get off the Iron Range, needed to put distance between himself and that frozen lake. But distance wasn't going to solve his problem. The message in his logbook haunted him through the entire drive south. 23 of us now. The words suggested something impossible, something that Abner's rational mind refused to accept even as the evidence sat right there in handwriting that wasn't his own. He'd tried to photograph the message with his phone, thinking he might need proof of what had happened, but every picture came out blurred and distorted, as if something was interfering with the camera's ability to capture the text. By the time Abner reached the truck stop outside of Virginia, Minnesota, it was almost dawn. The parking lot was half full of sleeping trucks, their exhaust pipes sending up white plumes in the frigid morning air. Abner pulled into a spot near the building and sat for several minutes, watching the sky lighten from black to gray. He needed coffee, needed food, and most of all he needed to talk to someone who might understand what he'd experienced on that ice. The truck stop diner was warm and bright, filled with the familiar sounds of truckers starting their day. Abner took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee from a waitress who looked like she'd been working the overnight shift for too many years. He was halfway through his first cup when he noticed the man sitting 3 stools down, watching him with an expression that suggested recognition. The man was older, maybe in his late 60s, with the weathered face and thick hands of someone who'd spent decades behind the wheel. He wore a faded trucker's cap with a logo that Abner didn't recognize, and his jacket had patches from trucking companies that didn't exist anymore. When their eyes met, the old man nodded slowly and gestured to the empty stool beside Abner. Mind if I join you? The old man's voice was rough, like gravel in a mixer. Abner shrugged his consent, and the man moved over with his coffee cup. They sat in silence for a moment, both staring at the counter, before the old man spoke again. You came across Vermilion last night, didn't you? Abner's head snapped up. How do you know that? The old man smiled, but there was no humor in it. You've got the look, same look I had back in '87 when I made that crossing. Same look every driver gets when they find out that Ice Road was closed for more reasons than the DNR wants to admit. He extended a hand. Name's Elspeth Quarry. Used to run the bait shop down by the lake access before I retired. Abner shook the offered hand, noting that Quarry's grip was still strong despite his age. Abner Coldwell. I didn't realize there was a bait shop down there. Didn't see any buildings when I came off the ice. That's because it's not there anymore, Quarry said. Burned down in '03, but I still live in the area, and I make it my business to know when someone crosses that lake. The ice talks, you see. Those of us who've been listening long enough can hear it. Abner wanted to dismiss the old man's words as the ramblings of someone who'd spent too much time alone, but something in Quarry's eyes suggested otherwise. This was someone who knew things, someone who might have answers to the questions that had been eating at Abner since he'd driven off that frozen lake. Tell me about Thaddeus Pike, Abner said quietly. Quarry's expression didn't change, but Abner saw his grip tighten slightly on his coffee cup. So you found his truck. I wondered how long it would be before someone stumbled across it. That ice has a way of holding on to things, preserving them like they're frozen in time. He paused, considering his words carefully. Pike was a good driver. Careful, professional. He knew those roads better than anyone, which is why the company kept sending him across Vermilion even after the official closure. What happened to him? Same thing that's happened to 22 other drivers over the years, Quarry said. He went out on that ice, and he never came back. They found his truck 6 weeks later, exactly where you saw it last night. No sign of Pike himself, no footprints, no blood, nothing. Just an empty cab and a logbook that ended with him saying he was heading for shore. Abner felt his stomach tighten. The radio said there were 23. If Pike was number 22, then someone else went down after him, Quarry finished. Probably within the last year or two. The ice keeps count, Coldwell. It knows how many souls it's holding. The waitress refilled their coffee cups, and both men waited until she was out of earshot before continuing. Abner pulled out his logbook and showed Quarry the message written in the margins. The old man studied it for a long moment, then nodded slowly as if confirming something he'd already suspected. You're marked now, Quarry said. The ice knows you escaped, knows you made it across when you shouldn't have. That doesn't sit well with what's down there. What is down there? Abner heard the desperation in his own voice. What were those things I saw? Quarry was quiet for so long that Abner thought he might not answer. Then the old man leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Back in the '70s, when that ice road was still in regular use, the mining companies discovered something. There were deposits under Vermilion, valuable minerals that they wanted to extract. They did some test drilling through the ice, sent down equipment to take samples from the lake bed. And they found out that lake is a lot deeper than any of the official maps show. In some places it goes down over 1,000 feet, but it's not the depth that was the problem. It was what they found in those deep places. Old things, Coldwell. Things that had been down there for a very long time, preserved in the cold and the dark. Abner felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. What kind of things? The kind that don't like being disturbed, Quarry said. The drilling woke them up, or maybe just made them aware of us. Either way, the accident started after that. First, it was just equipment failures and minor incidents. Then trucks started having problems out on the ice. Then drivers started disappearing. Why didn't they close the route immediately? Quarry's laugh was bitter. Money. Same reason for everything. The ice road saved the mining companies time and fuel costs. They didn't want to give it up just because a few drivers had some bad experiences. So they covered it up, explained away the disappearances as accidents or drivers abandoning their trucks. It wasn't until '87, when 3 trucks went down in the same winter, that they finally admitted there was a problem and closed the route officially. But trucks still cross, Abner said. Trucks still cross, Quarry agreed. Drivers who think they know better than the warning signs. Drivers running behind schedule who figure they can save time. Drivers who don't believe the stories because they've never seen anything to make them believe. He looked at Abner meaningfully. You believe now, don't you? Abner nodded slowly. Those things I saw coming up through the ice, the shapes following my truck, the ice walkers, Quarry said. That's what some of the old-timers call them, the things that move beneath the surface, that mark the trucks that cross their territory. They can't come onto land, or at least they haven't yet, but out on that ice, they're in control. What do they want? Quarry shrugged. Who can say? Maybe they want revenge for being disturbed. Maybe they're just protecting their territory. Or maybe they're hungry, and they've developed a taste for the souls of drivers who think they're invincible. He finished his coffee and stood up. What I can tell you is this. You got across, which means you're luckier than most. But the ice remembers, Coldwell. It holds on to things. You might want to think about avoiding the Iron Range for a while. Before Abner could respond, Quarry had dropped some money on the counter and was heading for the door. Abner watched him go, then looked down at his logbook again. The message was still there, but as Abner stared at it, he could swear the handwriting was changing, the letters rearranging themselves into new words. Come back soon, Coldwell. The ice gets lonely. Abner slammed the logbook shut and pushed away from the counter. He needed to get out of Minnesota, needed to put as many miles as possible between himself and that frozen lake. But as he walked back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that distance wasn't going to matter. The ice had marked him, and whatever was under that frozen surface wasn't going to forget. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of highways and truck stops. Abner took a load heading south, through Wisconsin and into Illinois, putting over 1,000 miles between himself and Lake Vermilion. He told himself that he was fine, that the experience had been traumatic but survivable, and that with time and distance he'd be able to process what had happened and move on with his life. But the signs started appearing almost immediately. The first one came that same afternoon. Abner was driving through Wisconsin when his CB radio picked up a conversation between 2 truckers discussing road conditions ahead. Nothing unusual about that, except that one of the voices sounded exactly like the distorted voice he'd heard on the ice. Same rough quality, same odd cadence, like someone speaking through water. Abner tried to convince himself it was a coincidence, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But then the voice said his name. Coldwell's running south on 53, left the Iron Range this morning. He thinks distance will keep him safe. The other voice on the radio responded, but Abner couldn't make out the words. The first voice continued, The ice follows, friend. The ice always follows. He'll learn that soon enough. Abner grabbed his microphone. Who is this? How do you know my name? Static was his only answer. He cycled through all the CB channels, but every frequency was silent, except for the occasional burst of normal trucker chatter. The mysterious voices were gone, leaving Abner to wonder if he'd imagined the entire conversation. The second sign came that evening when Abner stopped at a truck stop in Madison to refuel. As he was standing at the pump, Watching the numbers climb on the diesel meter, he noticed frost forming on his trailer. That wasn't unusual in February, but this frost was different. It was forming in patterns, geometric shapes that looked almost deliberate. And in the center of one of the frost patterns, clearly visible in the light from the fuel island, was a message. 22 days. Abner grabbed a rag and wiped away the frost, his hands shaking. When he looked again, the message was gone, but the trailer felt cold under his palm. Colder than it should be, even in sub-zero temperatures. It was like the metal itself was radiating cold from some internal source. The third sign came in the middle of the night. Abner was parked at a rest area in Illinois, trying to sleep in his cab, when he was awakened by sounds from outside. The same scraping sound he'd heard on the ice, the sound of metal being dragged across a hard surface. Abner sat up and looked out his windows, but the rest area was dark and quiet. The other trucks were still, their drivers presumably sleeping. Then Abner noticed the ice. It was spreading across the pavement, forming in thin sheets that reflected the light from the rest area's lamps. The ice was moving, growing outward from beneath Abner's truck like a living thing. As Abner watched, horrified, the ice began to form shapes. Hands, reaching up from the pavement as if trying to grasp something. Faces, pressed against the frozen surface like people trapped under glass. Abner started his engine and pulled out of the rest area without bothering to do his pre-trip inspection. In his mirrors, he could see the ice continuing to spread, covering the parking spot where he'd been sitting. Other truckers were beginning to emerge from their cabs, pointing at the phenomenon and pulling out their phones to take pictures. Abner didn't stop driving until he was 50 miles away. By the third day after his crossing of Lake Vermilion, Abner was exhausted and paranoid. He was seeing ice everywhere, even in places where it shouldn't form. His trailer's refrigeration unit wasn't running, but frost kept appearing on the doors. His mirrors frosted over even when the defroster was on high. And everywhere he stopped, he left behind patches of ice that seemed to linger long after he'd driven away. Other truckers were starting to notice. At a truck stop in Missouri, a driver Abner had known for years pulled him aside and asked if everything was okay. The man said that Abner's truck was giving off a cold that you could feel from 20 feet away, and that ice was forming on any surface his truck came near. The driver suggested that Abner might have a refrigerant leak or some kind of equipment malfunction. But Abner knew it wasn't mechanical failure. The cold was coming from something else, something that had attached itself to him during his crossing of that frozen lake. That night, Abner did something he'd been avoiding since leaving Minnesota. He called the mining company that had hired him for the delivery to Eerie. He got transferred through 3 different departments before finally reaching someone who would talk to him about the ice road crossing. The woman on the phone listened to Abner's story without interrupting. When he finished, there was a long silence before she spoke. "Mr. Coldwell, I need to ask you some questions. When you crossed Lake Vermilion, did you see any trucks other than the abandoned one you described?" "No, just Pike's truck." "Did you hear voices on your CB radio?" "Yes, a voice that knew my name." Another pause. "Mr. Coldwell, I'm going to transfer you to our safety department. What you experienced is something we need to document." The transfer led to another conversation, this time with a man who identified himself as a safety investigator. He asked more detailed questions about Abner's crossing, about the lights on the ice, about the sounds from below, about the shapes he'd seen following his truck. The investigator took careful notes, and when Abner finished his account, the man let out a long breath. "Mr. Coldwell, you're the 4th driver this winter to report an experience on Lake Vermilion. The other 3 all described similar phenomena: the blue lights, the sounds from beneath the ice, the feeling of being followed. All 3 of those drivers are experiencing the same symptoms you've described. The frost, the cold, the ice forming around their trucks. What's causing it? Abner demanded. We don't know, the investigator admitted. But we're working with some researchers who specialize in environmental anomalies. They have theories about geological formations under the lake that might create unusual electromagnetic fields, or temperature inversions that could cause hallucinations and sensory distortions. What I can tell you is that the symptoms do eventually fade. It takes time, usually several weeks, but the cold does dissipate, and the ice stops forming. Several weeks? Abner felt sick. I can't drive like this for several weeks. Other truckers are starting to avoid me. I'm leaving ice patches everywhere I park. We understand, Mr. Coldwell. The company is prepared to offer you paid leave while you recover from this experience. We'll also cover any psychological counseling you might need, and we'll make sure this incident doesn't affect your safety rating or employment record. The offer was generous, almost too generous. Abner realized that the company was trying to keep him quiet, to prevent him from talking publicly about what had happened on that ice. They were protecting themselves from liability, from accusations that they'd allowed drivers to use a dangerous route despite knowing the risks. But Abner didn't care about their motivations. He needed help, and if the company was willing to provide it, he'd take it. There's one more thing, the investigator said. The researchers I mentioned, they'd like to speak with you. They're documenting cases like yours, trying to understand the phenomenon. Would you be willing to meet with them? Abner agreed, and 2 days later he found himself sitting in a conference room at a research facility in Minneapolis, telling his story to a team of scientists who listened with expressions that ranged from skepticism to fascination. They examined his truck, took samples of the frost that kept forming on his trailer, and conducted a series of medical tests to determine if Abner had suffered any physical effects from his exposure to whatever was under that ice. The head researcher, a woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, showed Abner something that made his blood run cold. It was a map of Lake Vermilion, marked with red dots indicating locations where trucks had disappeared or drivers had reported unusual phenomena. The dots formed a pattern across the lake, concentrating in the deepest areas where the mining companies had done their test drilling back in the 70s. We believe, the researcher said, that the drilling created fractures in the lake bed that allowed something to escape from deeper geological formations. This something, whether it's a gas, a bacterial colony, or something else entirely, appears to have properties that affect human perception and possibly human consciousness. Drivers who cross the lake in certain areas are exposed to this phenomenon, and it creates lasting effects. The ice walkers, Abner said. That's what an old man at a truck stop called them. The researcher nodded. We've heard that term. Local folklore has stories about creatures that live under the ice, spirits or demons that claim the souls of travelers. But what we're looking at is likely something more mundane, even if we don't fully understand it yet. The human brain is extremely suggestible, Mr. Coldwell. When you're alone in extreme conditions, exhausted and stressed, exposed to unusual sounds and visual stimuli, your mind can create very convincing hallucinations. So you're saying it was all in my head? I'm saying your brain interpreted real phenomena in ways that made sense to you at the time, the researcher said carefully. The sounds you heard were probably ice expansion and contraction, amplified by acoustic properties of the lake. The shapes you saw were likely caused by light refraction through ice crystals and snow. The voices on your radio were interference from atmospheric conditions. All of these things are real, but your brain assembled them into a narrative that felt supernatural. Abner wanted to believe her, wanted to accept the scientific explanation that said he'd simply misinterpreted natural phenomena. But he couldn't forget the message in his logbook, written in handwriting that wasn't his own. Couldn't forget the way the ice had followed him for hundreds of miles after leaving that lake. "What about the frost?" he asked. "What about the ice that keeps forming on my truck?" The researcher hesitated. "We're still investigating that. It's possible that your truck was exposed to some kind of contaminant on the ice, a chemical or biological agent that's affecting the way moisture condenses on metal surfaces. We've taken samples and we're running tests. When we have answers, we'll let you know." Abner left the research facility with more questions than answers. He took the company's offer of paid leave and spent the next 3 weeks in a hotel room in Minneapolis, watching his truck slowly return to normal. The frost formations became less frequent. The cold radiating from his trailer gradually diminished, and the ice patches he left behind grew smaller until they finally stopped appearing altogether. But Abner knew he'd never be the same. Every time he looked at ice now, he saw faces. Every time he heard wind howling across a frozen surface, he heard voices. And every time he checked his logbook, he couldn't help but look for messages written in handwriting that wasn't his own. The number 22 haunted him. 22 drivers before Pike, plus Pike himself, made 23. But the ice had said there was always room for more. How many drivers had crossed that lake since Abner? How many had ignored the warning signs and thought they could save time by taking the shortcut? Abner never took another load to the Iron Range. When his leave ended and he returned to driving, he requested routes that kept him as far from Minnesota as possible. His dispatcher asked questions that Abner deflected with vague answers about wanting a change of scenery. The company's safety investigator called once a month to check on his condition and ask if he'd experienced any recurrence of symptoms. Abner always said he was fine, but he wasn't fine. He'd seen something on that ice, experienced something that scientific explanations couldn't fully account for. The researchers could talk about hallucinations and misinterpreted phenomena all they wanted, but they hadn't been there. They hadn't heard the voices or seen the shapes, or felt the intelligence behind the cold that had followed him. The ice remembered. Quarry had been right about that. And somewhere under the frozen surface of Lake Vermilion, 23 drivers were waiting for number 24. 3 months passed before Abner Coldwell heard from Elspeth Quarry again. By then, it was late May, and the ice range had thawed into the brief northern summer, transforming frozen lakes into bodies of dark water surrounded by endless green forest. Abner was hauling a load of construction equipment through Iowa when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, but that had a Minnesota area code. He almost didn't answer. Almost let it go to voicemail. But something made him pull over at the next rest area and take the call. Coldwell. Quarry's rough voice was immediately recognizable. "We need to talk. Can you get back up to the range?" "I'm not going anywhere near that lake," Abner said flatly. "Not the lake. Tower. The town. There's been a development, and you need to hear about it from someone who understands what you went through." Abner sat in his idling truck, watching other drivers come and go from the rest area building. Part of him wanted to hang up, to refuse whatever Quarry was asking. But the larger part, the part that still woke up from nightmares about shapes moving beneath ice, needed answers. What kind of development? "The kind that means number 24 just got added to the count," Quarry said. "Another driver crossed 2 nights ago. Didn't make it to the other side." Abner felt his stomach drop. They found a body? They found a truck, same condition as Pike's, same location, give or take 100 yards. Empty cab, logbook with the last entry saying the driver was heading for shore. No sign of the driver himself. Quarry paused. "But here's the thing that's got people spooked. The truck's computer system was still recording data when they found it. GPS, engine diagnostics, all of it. And according to the records, that truck was moving around on the ice for 3 hours after the last logbook entry." "Moving how?" "In circles," Quarry said. "Perfect circles. like it was being driven by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, except there was nobody in the driver's seat. Abner closed his eyes and saw again the shapes rising from the cracked ice, reaching toward his trailer with movements that defied physics. "I'll be there tomorrow." He made the drive north through the night, running on coffee and nervous energy. By the time he reached Tower, the sun was rising over the thick forest that surrounded the small mining town. Quarry had given him directions to a mechanic's shop on the edge of town, a weathered building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Pike's Garage, full-service truck repair." Abner pulled into the gravel lot and shut off his engine. Before he could climb out of his cab, a man emerged from the garage bay, wiping his hands on a rag. He was in his 40s, built like someone who'd spent years doing manual labor, with the kind of face that suggested he didn't smile often. "You must be Coldwell," the man said. "I'm Thaddeus Pike. No relation to the driver who went missing in '01, despite what the sign says. Bought this place from his family after they gave up waiting for him to come back." Abner shook the offered hand, noting the strength in Pike's grip. "Quarry said you could show me something." "Inside," Pike said, gesturing toward the garage. "Not something I want to discuss where anyone passing by might hear." The garage was dim and smelled of motor oil and welding flux. Pike led Abner to a small office in the back where Quarry was already waiting, seated in a chair that looked like it might collapse under his weight. The old man nodded at Abner, but didn't stand. "Show him," Quarry said to Pike. Pike pulled out a laptop and opened a file. "This is the data we pulled from the truck's computer before the state police impounded the vehicle. Driver's name was Marcus Vane, been hauling for a company out of Duluth for 6 years. Clean record, good reputation, the kind of driver who doesn't take stupid risks." He turned the laptop so Abner could see the screen. "Here's his route on the night he disappeared." The GPS track showed Vane's truck leaving Duluth and heading north on Highway 169, taking the same route Abner had followed. At the Tower Access Road, the truck left the highway and headed toward the lake. Then the track became a series of circular patterns, dozens of loops that covered a roughly circular area about half a mile in diameter. "He drove in circles for 3 hours, Pike said. Speed varied between 5 and 15 miles per hour. No stops, no deviation from the circular pattern. Then, at 0347, the truck stopped moving. Engine kept running for another 20 minutes, then shut off. When we found it the next morning, it was exactly where the GPS said it would be, sitting in the middle of those circles like the center of a target." Abner studied the pattern. The circles were too perfect to be random, too deliberate to be the result of a confused driver. It looked like something had been controlling the truck, driving it through a specific pattern for a specific purpose. "There's more," Quarry said. "Tell him about the ice." Pike minimized the GPS window and opened another file, this one containing photographs. They showed the area around Vane's truck, and Abner felt his breath catch when he saw what the images revealed. The ice in that circular area was different from the surrounding surface. It was darker, almost black, and it had a texture that looked like shattered glass frozen in place. "Same as around the blue light posts," Abner said quietly. "Same as around every truck that's been found abandoned on that lake," Quarry confirmed. "The ice changes where they make contact, changes permanently. You can still see the marks from trucks that went down in the '80s, even after the spring thaw and refreeze. The pattern stays there year after year, like a scar." Pike switched to another photograph, this one a close-up of the ice surface. In the fractured patterns, Abner could see what looked like handprints, dozens of them pressed into the ice from below. The prints were small, like children's hands, but the fingers were too long and the spacing was wrong. "What are we looking at?" Abner asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Evidence, Pike said simply. Evidence that something under that ice is very interested in the trucks that cross above it. Something that's been reaching up, trying to make contact, trying to pull drivers down for reasons we don't understand. Quarry leaned forward in his chair. The thing you need to understand, Coldwell, is that Lake Vermilion isn't the only place this happens. There are frozen lakes all across the northern states where truckers have reported similar phenomena. Missing drivers, abandoned trucks, ice that changes in ways that don't match any natural process. Someone, somewhere, is documenting all of it, trying to understand what's happening. The researchers I talked to in Minneapolis, Abner said. They told me it was hallucinations, sensory distortion caused by environmental factors. Those researchers were lying to you, Quarry said bluntly. Or maybe they were lying to themselves. But the truth is that something is happening on these lakes, something that started with those mining company test drills and has been getting worse every year since. Pike closed his laptop. We're not the only ones who've noticed. There's an informal network of mechanics, truck stop owners, dispatchers, people in the industry who've seen too many drivers disappear on ice crossings. We share information, try to warn drivers away from the most dangerous routes. But there's only so much we can do when drivers like Vane decide to take the shortcut despite the warnings. Did Vane know about the risks? Abner asked. He'd been warned, Quarry said. 6 months ago, another driver told him about the strange things that happen on Vermilion. Vane laughed it off, said he didn't believe in ghost stories. Then 2 nights ago, he was running behind schedule on a delivery to Ely, and he decided to cross the ice. He made it further than most, Pike added. Most drivers who ignore the warnings don't even get halfway across before something happens. The fact that Vane made it to the center of the lake suggests he was either very skilled or very lucky. But luck runs out eventually. Abner looked at the closed laptop, thinking about the GPS tracks that showed those perfect circles. You said the truck was moving after Vane disappeared. Do you have any theory about what was driving it? The two men exchanged a glance. Finally, Quarry spoke. We have theories. None of them are comforting. The simplest explanation is that the truck's computer system was compromised, that something interfered with the electronic controls and made the vehicle move according to a programmed pattern. But you don't believe that, Abner said. No, Quarry admitted. What we believe is that something took control of that truck the same way something tried to take control of yours. The difference is that Vane didn't make it to shore. Whatever grabbed him had time to do what it wanted, and what it wanted was to make that truck drive in circles until it had finished some kind of ritual or process that we don't understand. Pike stood and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner of the office. He pulled out a thick folder and dropped it on the desk in front of Abner. This is everything we've collected over the past 15 years. Reports from drivers who crossed and survived, autopsy reports from the few bodies that were recovered, geological surveys of the lake bed, even some testimony from the mining company employees who were there when they did the test drilling. Abner opened the folder and found himself looking at a photograph of a frozen lake at night, illuminated by the same blue lights he'd seen during his crossing. The image had been taken from the shore, and in the distance, barely visible, was a truck moving across the ice. That photo was taken in '93, Quarry said. 4 years after the official closure. The truck in that picture was never found. Driver's name was Sarah Millwood, 38 years old, mother of 3. She radioed in a distress call saying something was following her across the ice, and then her radio went dead. State police searched for 2 weeks and found nothing. No truck, no tracks, nothing. Abner flipped through more photographs, more reports, building a picture of something that had been happening for decades. The pattern was consistent. Drivers crossed the ice despite warnings, encountered phenomena they couldn't explain, and either escaped or disappeared. Those who escaped reported similar experiences: blue lights, sounds from below, shapes in the ice, a sense of being watched and followed by something with hostile intent. "Why are you showing me this?" Abner asked. "I got away. I'm not planning to go back." "Because you're one of the few drivers who's experienced it and lived to talk about it openly," Pike said. "Most drivers who survive the crossing don't want to discuss it. They're afraid people will think they're crazy, or they're worried about their safety ratings, or they've convinced themselves it was all hallucinations like those researchers told you. But you're different. You know what you saw was real. We need your help," Quarry said. "The network I mentioned, the people who've been tracking these incidents, were trying to organize a proper investigation. Get real scientists involved, people who aren't being paid by mining companies or state agencies with a vested interest in keeping this quiet. But we need testimonials from credible witnesses. We need drivers like you who'll go on record about what happened." Abner closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk. "I already told the company's investigators everything, gave them a full statement, cooperated with their research team. And they buried it," Pike said. "Filed it away under environmental anomaly and made sure nothing would come of it. The mining companies don't want attention on these lakes, Coldwell. There are billions of dollars in mineral deposits under the water, and they're just waiting for the right opportunity to go after them. The last thing they need is stories about supernatural entities or unexplained phenomena scaring away workers and creating regulatory complications." "What makes you think a proper investigation would accomplish anything?" Abner asked. "Even if scientists confirm that something unusual is happening, what are they going to do about it? You can't arrest or prosecute something that lives under ice. You can't negotiate with it or contain it." "No," Quarry agreed. "But we can warn people. We can make sure every driver who thinks about crossing that ice knows exactly what they're risking. We can pressure state agencies to enforce the closure properly. Maybe even get federal involvement if the phenomenon is widespread enough. Right now, the only thing standing between drivers and whatever's under that ice is word of mouth and folklore. We need to do better." Abner was silent for a long moment, considering. He thought about the message in his logbook, the frost that had followed him for weeks, the nightmares that still woke him in the middle of the night. He thought about Marcus Vane, driving in circles for 3 hours while something from below the ice did whatever it had done to him. He thought about the 24 drivers whose trucks had been found abandoned, and the unknown number who had disappeared completely, leaving no trace behind. "What do you need from me?" he finally asked. Pike opened his laptop again and pulled up a document. "We're compiling a comprehensive report that will go to the Department of Transportation, the EPA, and several scientific organizations. We need detailed testimonials from every surviving driver we can locate. Times, dates, specific descriptions of what you experienced. The more detail we have, the harder it will be for authorities to dismiss this as folklore or mass hysteria." "I'll give you my statement," Abner said. "But I want something in return." "Name it," Quarry said. "I want to know what the mining companies found when they did those test drills. The real findings, not the sanitized version they gave to regulators. If I'm going to put my name on a report that might end my career in this industry, I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." The two men exchanged another glance. Finally, Pike nodded. "Fair enough, but you're not going to like what you hear." He pulled out another folder, this one with "Confidential" stamped across the front in faded red letters. "This is a copy of the original drill report from '76. Took us 3 years to track down someone who had access to the mining company's archives, and another 2 years to convince them to make a copy for us. What you're about to read has never been made public. Abner opened the folder and began reading. The report was written in technical language that took him several minutes to parse, but the essential facts were clear enough. The mining company had conducted test drilling at 17 locations across Lake Vermilion, taking core samples from depths of up to 1,200 feet. What they'd found at those depths had alarmed them enough to halt all drilling operations immediately. The core samples contained biological material. Not fossils or ancient organic deposits, but living tissue that had been preserved in the cold and pressure of the deep lake bed. The tissue samples defied classification, showing characteristics of both plant and animal life while matching neither category completely. When exposed to surface temperatures and normal atmospheric pressure, the tissue had begun to grow, spreading through the drilling equipment and contaminating the work site. More disturbing was what happened to the workers who came into direct contact with the contaminated equipment. 3 men reported experiencing vivid hallucinations and extreme paranoia. 2 of them were hospitalized with symptoms that resembled severe frostbite, despite having worked in climate-controlled conditions. 1 worker disappeared entirely, last seen walking out onto the frozen lake during his overnight shift. His body was never recovered. The mining company had sealed the drill sites and abandoned their plans for underwater mineral extraction. They'd also paid substantial settlements to the affected workers and their families, with strict non-disclosure agreements attached. According to the report, the company had consulted with several biologists and environmental scientists, none of whom could explain what the tissue samples were or where they might have originated. "They woke something up," Abner said quietly. "Those test drills, they pierced something that had been dormant for who knows how long." "That's what we think," Quarry confirmed. "And whatever they woke up, it's been growing and spreading ever since. The blue lights you saw, we think those are markers. Something under the ice is claiming territory, establishing boundaries. The ice walkers, the shapes you saw, they might be some kind of guardians or defenders of that territory. Or hunters," Pike added. "Something that's learned to recognize the trucks crossing above it, learned to track them and trap them." Abner closed the report and sat back in his chair. The scope of what they were suggesting was staggering. Not a simple haunting or isolated phenomenon, but an ongoing biological or ecological process that had been set in motion by human interference and was now claiming victims on a regular basis. "How many lakes?" he asked. "We've documented similar incidents on at least 47 lakes across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and parts of Canada," Pike said. "Probably more that we don't know about. Anywhere there were mining operations or deep water drilling in the 70s and 80s, anywhere they might have disturbed whatever's down there." 47 lakes, Abner repeated. "That means potentially hundreds of miles of ice road where drivers could encounter this thing." "Which is why we need to go public," Quarry said. "Why we need drivers like you to speak up and force authorities to take this seriously. The longer we wait, the more drivers disappear." Abner nodded slowly. "I'll give you my statement. Everything I saw, everything I experienced. But I have one condition." "What's that?" "I want access to everything you've collected. All the reports, all the photographs, all the testimonials from other drivers. If I'm going to testify about this, I want to know I'm not the only one who sounds crazy." Pike smiled for the first time since Abner had arrived. "Deal. And Coldwell? For what it's worth, you're probably the sanest person I've talked to about this. Most people refuse to even consider the possibility that something like this could be real." "I've seen it," Abner said simply. "I know what's under that ice, and I know it's waiting for the next driver who thinks they're smart enough to beat the odds." The 3 men spent the next 4 hours going through Abner's testimony, documenting every detail of his crossing and the aftermath. By the time they finished, the sun was setting over the Iron Range, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that reminded Abner uncomfortably of the blue lights on the ice. As Abner prepared to leave, Quarry pulled him aside. "One more thing you should know. The driver count isn't 24 anymore. While we've been sitting here, state police got a call about another truck found on Vermilion. Engine running, cab empty, driver vanished." 25, Abner said. 25, Quarry confirmed. "And it's only June. Ice won't form thick enough for crossing until December at the earliest. That means whatever's under that lake is getting more aggressive, claiming victims even when the ice is thin and unstable. It's learning, Coldwell, getting better at what it does." Abner walked back to his truck through the gathering darkness, his mind full of everything he'd learned. Behind him, Pike's garage was lit up against the night, a small island of warmth and light in the vast darkness of the Iron Range. Abner wondered how many other drivers had stood in this parking lot, looking at that light and trying to convince themselves that what they'd experienced on the ice could be explained away. He climbed into his cab and checked his logbook before starting the engine. The pages were clean, no mysterious messages written in handwriting that wasn't his own. But as Abner flipped to the current page to log his location, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was a small mark in the margin, barely visible. It looked like it had been made with ice, a tiny crystalline formation that had somehow appeared on the paper. And as Abner watched, the ice began to spread, forming letters, forming words. "You told them everything, Coldwell. Now they'll come looking. Now they'll all want to know what's under the ice. And when they come, we'll be waiting." The ice evaporated as Abner watched, leaving behind nothing but a faint water stain on the paper. But the message had been clear. Whatever was under Lake Vermilion knew that Abner had talked, and it wasn't happy about it. Abner Coldwell didn't go home after leaving Pike's garage. He drove south through the night, putting miles between himself and the Iron Range, but his mind kept circling back to that message in his logbook. The ice knew he'd talked. The ice was watching. By the time he reached the truck stop outside of Hinckley, it was past midnight and the parking lot was full of sleeping rigs. Abner found a spot near the back, away from the lights, and sat in his cab with the engine running. He needed to think, needed to figure out what the message meant and what he should do about it. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Pike's number. "We've got a problem," Pike said without preamble. "About an hour after you left, someone broke into the garage, took the laptop with all the GPS data from Vane's truck, took the drill report too, along with half the files from the cabinet." Abner felt his stomach clench. Security cameras? Disabled. Cut the power to the whole building before they went in. Professional job, whoever it was knew exactly what they were looking for. Pike paused. "Coldwell, I need to ask you something. Did anyone follow you when you left tower?" "I don't think so. I was watching my mirrors." "You're sure? Because the timing is too perfect. You show up, we brief you on everything, you leave, and an hour later, someone steals all the evidence we've been collecting for years." Abner understood what Pike was implying. "You think I led them to you. I think something knows you came to see us, and I think that something is making sure we can't prove what's happening on those lakes." Pike's voice was tight with anger. "Quarry's already talking about shutting down the network. Says it's too dangerous to keep collecting information if we're being actively monitored." "Who would be monitoring us? The mining companies? Maybe. Or maybe something else. Something that doesn't want attention drawn to what's under the ice." Pike let out a long breath. "Look, I'm not blaming you, Coldwell. This was probably inevitable, but I needed you to know what happened. And I need to warn you that you might be in danger. If they came after the files, they might come after the witnesses, too." After the call ended, Abner sat in silence, staring at the empty parking lot. He thought about the shapes he'd seen rising from the ice, the way they'd moved with purpose and intelligence. He thought about the perfect circles Vane's truck had driven, like something was performing a ritual or sending a signal, and he thought about that message in his logbook, written in frost, that evaporated as soon as he read it. The ice was watching. The ice was learning. And now the ice knew that people were trying to expose what lived beneath it. Abner made a decision. He pulled out his phone and started recording a video, speaking directly to the camera in his truck's dim interior. My name is Abner Coldwell. I've been driving long haul for 11 years. Clean safety record. No history of substance abuse or mental health issues. In February of this year, I crossed Lake Vermilion in Minnesota using an abandoned ice road. What I experienced there was real. The blue lights, the sounds from beneath the ice, the shapes following my truck. All of it was real, and I'm not the only driver who's seen it. He continued talking for 20 minutes, documenting everything he'd experienced and everything he'd learned from Quarry and Pike. When he finished, he uploaded the video to 3 different cloud storage services and sent the links to a dozen trucking forums and social media groups. If something happened to him, if he disappeared like the other drivers, at least his testimony would survive. The response to his video was immediate and divided. Some truckers shared their own stories of strange encounters on frozen lakes. Others accused Abner of making up ghost stories for attention. Several dispatchers and company representatives warned that posting such content could be grounds for termination or blacklisting in the industry. But the video kept spreading, shared and reshared across trucker networks, picking up thousands of views in the first few hours. Abner knew he'd crossed a line. He'd made himself a target, put his career and possibly his life at risk. But he couldn't stay silent anymore. Couldn't let drivers keep crossing those lakes without knowing what waited beneath the ice. His phone started ringing constantly. Other drivers wanting to share their stories. Reporters asking for interviews. Even a producer from a true crime podcast wanting to feature his account. Abner ignored most of the calls, but he did respond to messages from drivers who claimed to have experienced similar phenomena. By dawn, he'd collected a dozen new testimonials, each one describing encounters on different frozen lakes across the northern states. The pattern was consistent, blue lights marking routes across the ice. Sounds from below that suggested intelligence and intent. Shapes moving beneath the surface or rising through cracks. Trucks found abandoned with no trace of their drivers, and always the feeling of being watched by something that understood human behavior and was learning to exploit it. One message in particular caught Abner's attention. It came from a driver named Rita Hollis, who claimed to have crossed Lake Vermilion 3 weeks before Abner's crossing. She'd experienced the same phenomena, but had made it to shore despite being followed by what she described as things that looked almost human, but moved like they were underwater even though they were on top of the ice. Abner called her immediately. Rita answered on the second ring, her voice wary. "You're the guy from the video," she said. "The one who finally had the guts to talk about it publicly." "I am. Your message said you crossed 3 weeks before I did. Did you report what you saw?" "To who? The company would have sent me for a psych eval. The police would have written it off as stress or hallucinations." Rita's voice carried the bitterness of someone who'd been forced to keep silent about something traumatic. "I've been driving these routes for 15 years, Coldwell. I know the difference between seeing things and really seeing things. What's under that ice is real, and it's getting worse every year." Worse how? More aggressive. More organized. I've crossed Vermilion maybe a dozen times over the years, always in winter when it was the only way to make delivery windows. The first few times it was just strange lights and odd sounds. Unsettling but manageable. But the last few years it's been different. The things under the ice, they're learning our patterns. They know when trucks are likely to cross, what routes we take, how fast we travel. You think they're hunting us, Abner said. I think they're farming us, Rita replied. Taking drivers when they can, studying the ones who get away, building some kind of collection or database, and I think they're spreading, moving from lake to lake through underground connections. Every year, there are more lakes where drivers report problems, more disappearances, more abandoned trucks. Abner felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. If they're spreading, it means eventually there won't be any safe routes across frozen lakes, Rita finished. Means truckers in the northern states will have to add hundreds of miles to their routes, lose millions of dollars in time and fuel, which is probably what the mining companies want, since it'll force infrastructure development and give them excuse to push for new ice roads and drilling operations. You think the companies know about this? I think some people in those companies know exactly what's down there and are trying to figure out how to profit from it. Why else would someone break into Pike's garage and steal all that evidence? Rita paused. Coldwell, you need to be careful. You made yourself visible with that video. If something wants to silence people who talk about the ice, you just painted a target on your back. After hanging up with Rita, Abner tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those shapes rising through the fractured ice, reaching for his truck with movements that suggested hunger or desperation, or something beyond human understanding. He finally gave up and got back on the road, driving south toward loads that would keep him far from frozen lakes. But the ice followed him. It started small, frost forming on his mirrors in patterns that looked almost like writing. The temperature gauge in his cab fluctuating even though the heater was set on constant. A thin layer of ice appearing on his coffee cup despite the ambient temperature being well above freezing. Abner tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was coincidence or residual effects from his February crossing. Then his CB radio started picking up transmissions that shouldn't exist. He was driving through Nebraska, nowhere near any frozen lakes, when he heard a voice on Channel 19 that he recognized. It was the same distorted voice from his crossing, the one that had known his name and warned him about the ice. Coldwell's running south on 80. Thinks distance will keep him safe. Thinks talking about us will protect him. Abner grabbed his microphone. Who is this? What do you want? The response came immediately. We want what was taken. We want what was disturbed. We want equilibrium restored. I don't understand. The drilling, the test samples, the tissue that was removed from the deep places. The voice was clearer now, almost human. Your kind took pieces of us, studied us, tried to exploit us. We're taking pieces of you in return. Fair exchange. Balance. Abner's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The missing drivers. You're collecting them like the mining companies collected samples. Learning them, understanding them, adding them to the cold and the dark where they can teach us about your world. The voice paused. 25 now. But we need more. We need the ones who talk, who share our secrets. We need you, Coldwell. The radio went silent. Abner tried cycling through channels, but every frequency was dead. He drove in silence for an hour before his phone rang. It was Quarry. Abner, where are you right now? Nebraska. Why? Get somewhere public. Truck stop, rest area, anywhere with lots of people and lights. Quarry's voice carried an urgency that made Abner's pulse quicken. Pike and I have been digging deeper into the mining company files. We found something that explains everything, but you're not going to like it. Tell me. The tissue samples they pulled from Lake Vermilion in '76. They didn't just contaminate the drilling equipment. They contaminated the workers who handled them. Those 3 men who got sick, the one who disappeared, they all tested positive for some kind of organism that had infiltrated their bloodstream. The mining company quarantined them, ran tests for months. What happened to them? That's the thing. According to the files, 2 of them recovered completely. No trace of the organism in their system. But they both reported persistent dreams about being underwater, about drowning in cold darkness. And they both developed an obsessive interest in frozen lakes. One of them got a job as an ice road supervisor. The other started working for the DNR, managing lake access permits. Abner understood what Quarry was implying. They were infected, changed, turned into something that would help protect what's under the ice. More than that, we think they're still out there, along with others who've been exposed over the years. A network of people who look human, but are working for whatever lives in those deep places. People who can move in our world, gather intelligence, interfere with anyone trying to expose the truth. That's who broke into your garage. Probably. And Coldwell, there's something else. The mining company files include a list of all personnel who were exposed to the contaminated equipment. Not just the 3 who got sick, but dozens of workers who had indirect contact. They've been tracking these people for decades, monitoring them for signs of infection or behavioral changes. Why are you telling me this? Quarry's voice dropped lower. Because your name is on a list. Not the mining company's list, but one we found in Pike's garage after the break-in. Someone left it behind, like they wanted us to see it. It's a list of drivers who've crossed infected lakes and survived. 23 names, Coldwell, and yours is at the top. Abner pulled off at the next exit and parked at a brightly lit truck stop. His hands were shaking as he processed what Quarry had told him. He'd been marked, targeted, placed on some kind of list by people or things that wanted to collect him. "What do I do?" he asked. "Short term, stay visible, stay around people. Whatever these things are, they seem to avoid direct confrontation when there are witnesses." Quarry paused. "Long term, I don't know. Maybe there is no long term. Maybe once you're on that list, it's just a matter of time." After hanging up, Abner sat in his truck and watched other drivers come and go from the truck stop. Normal people doing normal jobs, unaware that something was slowly claiming victims from their profession. He thought about making another video, warning drivers about the list and the infection and everything Quarry had discovered. But would anyone believe him, or would it just make him look more unstable, more deserving of whatever fate awaited him? His logbook was sitting on the passenger seat. Abner opened it and found a new message, this one written in what looked like condensed water droplets that caught the light from the parking lot. "You can't hide, Coldwell, can't run far enough or fast enough. The cold is everywhere water freezes, every winter lake, every frozen pond, every patch of ice in every northern state. We're in all of them now, connected through the deep places, and we're waiting." The message evaporated as he watched, leaving behind a faint stain on the paper. Abner closed the logbook and looked out at the Nebraska landscape, trying to spot any frozen water. It was June, too warm for ice, but he knew that winter would come eventually. Winter always came. His phone buzzed with a text from Pike. "Turn on the news. National coverage." Abner pulled out his phone and found a news article about mysterious disappearances on frozen lakes across the northern United States and Canada. The article mentioned his video by name, quoted testimonials from other drivers, and included statements from law enforcement agencies confirming that dozens of truckers had vanished while crossing frozen lakes over the past 3 decades. The phenomenon was finally getting mainstream attention, but the article also included a response from the mining industry claiming that the disappearances were due to drivers ignoring safety regulations and taking unauthorized routes across unstable ice. They blamed the incidents on human error and poor judgment, not unexplained phenomena, and they announced plans to petition for reopening several closed ice roads under new safety protocols and monitoring systems. Abner realized what was happening. The publicity from his video hadn't scared the mining companies into backing down. It had given them cover to push for exactly what they wanted: official sanction to return to the lakes, to resume drilling operations, to continue their exploration of whatever lived in the deep places. His phone rang again. Unknown number, local area code. Against his better judgment, Abner answered. "Mr. Coldwell." The voice was male, professional, with the kind of polished tone that suggested corporate management. "My name is irrelevant. What's relevant is that you've caused some significant complications with your video. We need to discuss how to resolve this situation. Who are you? Someone who understands what you saw on Lake Vermilion. Someone who knows that what you experienced was real, but needs to remain undisclosed for the greater good. The mining deposits under those lakes represent billions in economic value, Mr. Coldwell. They could power the next generation of technology, create thousands of jobs, transform entire regions, but that can only happen if we can work without interference from supernatural hysteria. People are dying," Abner said. "People die in industrial accidents all the time. It's unfortunate but acceptable if the benefits outweigh the costs. What's not acceptable is drivers spreading panic and conspiracy theories that interfere with legitimate business operations." The man's tone hardened. "We're prepared to offer you compensation for your silence. A substantial sum, enough to retire comfortably and never drive truck again. All you have to do is retract your video and sign a non-disclosure agreement. And if I refuse, then you'll learn that there are consequences for interfering with forces you don't understand. Some of those consequences will be legal, some will be professional, and some—" The man paused meaningfully. "Some will be much colder." The line went dead. Abner sat in stunned silence, processing the implied threat. They were offering him money to disappear quietly, and threatening him with something worse if he didn't comply. But the threat felt hollow somehow, like they were trying to scare him away from something they couldn't directly control. That realization gave Abner an idea. If the mining companies were afraid of publicity, if they were trying to buy his silence, it meant his video had hurt them more than he'd realized. It meant that exposure was the one weapon that might actually work against them. Abner spent the next 3 hours on his phone, contacting every journalist and podcast host who'd reached out after his video. He gave interviews, shared everything Quarry and Pike had discovered, named the mining companies involved in the original drilling operations. He became a one-man publicity campaign, determined to make the story too big to suppress or ignore. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, major news outlets were picking up the story. Environmental groups were demanding investigations into the drilling operations. Politicians were calling for hearings. And, most importantly, truckers across the northern states were refusing to cross frozen lakes, forcing companies to use alternative routes and drawing attention to the danger. But Abner knew he'd made himself a target. The phone call had made that clear. Something wanted him silent, and it would eventually come for him the way it had come for 25 other drivers. He just didn't know when. 2 weeks later, Abner received a package at a truck stop in Colorado. No return address, no indication of who'd sent it. Inside was a single photograph, taken from a security camera by the shore of Lake Vermilion. The image showed Abner's truck on the ice, surrounded by shapes that the camera had captured as dark silhouettes against the white surface. And standing on the shore, watching his truck cross, was a figure that looked almost human but stood too still, its posture suggesting patience rather than concern. written on the back of the photograph in handwriting that matched the messages in his logbook. "We're patient, Coldwell. We've been waiting in the cold for thousands of years. We can wait a little longer for you." Abner burned the photograph, but he couldn't burn the memory of what it showed. Something had been watching his crossing from the shore. Something that looked human enough to pass unnoticed but moved with the same wrong physics as the shapes under the ice. He continues driving, continues telling his story to anyone who will listen. But he knows the truth that keeps him awake during long night drives through the northern states. The ice is waiting for him, waiting for winter when the lakes freeze solid again, waiting for the moment when he makes a mistake, takes a wrong turn, finds himself on a frozen surface with nowhere to run. Abner checks his mirrors constantly now, watching for shapes that move wrong or lights that shine blue in the darkness. He avoids frozen lakes, even goes hundreds of miles out of his way to ensure he never drives across ice. But he knows that eventually winter will come. The roads will freeze, and the things that live in the deep, cold places will have another chance to add him to their collection. 25 drivers taken, 1 driver marked and waiting, and countless others who still cross those frozen lakes, unaware of what reaches up from below, learning their patterns and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The ice remembers. The ice is patient. And somewhere under Lake Vermilion, in cold darkness that has never seen sunlight, something is counting down to the next winter, the next crossing, the next driver who thinks they can beat the odds. Abner Coldwell keeps driving, keeps watching, keeps waiting for the day when the ice finally catches up to him. Because deep down, he knows it's not a question of if, it's only a question of when. Merritt Voss had been driving the Wisconsin routes for 9 years when he learned that some blizzards carry more than just snow. It was late January 2023, and Merritt was hauling a load of paper products from a mill outside of Rhinelander to a distribution center in Ashland, a route he'd driven so many times he could navigate it half asleep. The weather forecast had called for light snow, maybe 3 inches overnight. Nothing that would slow down an experienced driver with a properly maintained rig. The forecast was wrong. By the time Merritt reached the turnoff for County Road FF, the light snow had transformed into a full blizzard. Wind gusts were hitting 50 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet. Merritt's headlights reflected off the swirling snow, creating a hypnotic wall of white that made it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. He should have pulled over. Should have waited out the storm at one of the truck stops back on Highway 51. But Merritt was running behind schedule, and the distribution center in Ashland had a strict delivery window. Miss the window, and the load got rejected, which meant no payment and a black mark on his record. So Merritt kept driving, slowing to 30 miles per hour, and trusting his knowledge of the route to keep him on the road. That's when he saw the light. It appeared off to his right, maybe 100 yards into the woods that bordered the county road. At first, Merritt thought it might be a house or a barn, someone's porch light cutting through the storm. But the light was moving, swinging back and forth in a deliberate pattern that suggested someone was signaling. The movement reminded Merritt of an old-fashioned lantern, the kind you'd wave to flag down help. Merritt slowed his truck even further, trying to get a better look at the light. The storm made it difficult to judge distance or direction, but he could see that whoever was holding that light was moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with his truck. Every few seconds, the light would swing in a wider arc, as if the person carrying it was trying to get Merritt's attention. Someone was in trouble out there. Had to be. Nobody would be walking through a blizzard like this unless they were desperate, unless they'd gotten stranded or lost and needed help. Merritt had seen enough winter accidents on these northern routes to know that exposure killed fast, when temperatures dropped below zero and the wind chill made it feel like -30. He pulled his truck over onto what he hoped was the shoulder of the road, the visibility so poor he couldn't be certain where the pavement ended and the ditch began. Merritt grabbed his heavy coat from behind the seat, pulled on his insulated gloves, and climbed out into the screaming wind. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water immediately. Snow stung his exposed skin, and within seconds his beard was crusted with ice. "Hey!" Merritt shouted toward the trees where he'd seen the light. "You need help?" The wind swallowed his words. The light continued moving through the woods, still swinging in that deliberate pattern. Merritt could see it more clearly now that he was outside his truck. It definitely looked like a lantern, casting a warm yellow glow that seemed impossibly bright given the conditions. And whoever was carrying it was moving steadily deeper into the forest, away from the road. Merritt hesitated. Every instinct told him not to leave his truck, not to venture into the woods during a blizzard. But if someone was lost out there, someone who'd wandered away from a vehicle or a cabin in confusion or panic, they might not survive the night without help. Merritt had a responsibility to at least check, to make sure whoever was carrying that lantern knew how to get back to safety. He pulled out his phone and checked for signal. 1 bar, barely enough to maintain connection. Merritt sent a quick text to his dispatcher with his location and a note that he was investigating what might be a stranded motorist. Then he grabbed his flashlight from the truck's toolbox and headed into the woods, following the glow of that swinging lantern. The forest was dense with pine and birch, the trees creating a slight windbreak that made the blizzard marginally more bearable. Snow had accumulated in deep drifts between the trunks, and Merritt found himself wading through powder that sometimes reached his knees. The lantern light stayed ahead of him, always just visible through the trees, always moving at a pace that kept it about 50 yards ahead of his position. "Hey, wait up," Merritt called. "I'm trying to help you." The light didn't slow down. If anything, it seemed to be moving faster, drawing Merritt deeper into the woods. He'd been walking for maybe 5 minutes when he realized he could no longer see his truck's lights behind him. The forest had swallowed him completely, and the blizzard had erased any trace of his footprints almost as soon as he made them. Merritt stopped walking and took stock of his situation. He was in the middle of a forest during a blizzard, following a light that might belong to someone who was lost or confused or possibly hypothermic. He had no clear way to navigate back to his truck except by retracing his steps, and those steps were being covered by fresh snow every few seconds. This had been a mistake, and Merritt knew he needed to turn back before he became another casualty of northern Wisconsin winter. But as he turned to head back toward the road, the lantern light changed direction. It stopped moving away from him and instead began approaching, swinging back and forth in that same deliberate pattern. Merritt stood still and waited as the light drew closer, finally close enough that he could see the person carrying it. It was a woman, middle-aged, wearing a long, dark coat that looked too thin for the weather. She held an old-fashioned oil lantern in one gloved hand, raising it high as she approached. Her face was pale, her lips slightly blue from the cold, but she was smiling as if she'd just found something she'd been searching for. "Thank God," Merritt said, relief flooding through him. "I saw your light from the road. Are you okay? Is your car stuck somewhere?" The woman's smile didn't waver. "My car is fine. I was hoping you'd follow the light. Most drivers don't stop anymore. Too busy, too focused on their schedules. But you stopped, you followed. That shows character." Something about her tone made Merritt uneasy. She wasn't acting like someone who needed help. She was acting like someone who'd been waiting for him specifically. "Ma'am, we need to get you somewhere warm. My truck's back on the road." "Your truck is gone," the woman said simply. "What? No, it's right back." Merritt turned to point in the direction he'd come from, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed to have shifted position, creating a wall of trunks and shadows that blocked any view of where he'd entered the woods. And, more disturbing, he couldn't see any sign of his own footprints. The snow behind him was pristine and undisturbed, as if he'd materialized in this spot rather than walked to it. "You're on the lake now," the woman continued. "Not the road, the lake. You've been walking on ice for the past 3 minutes, following my light across frozen water. And now you're exactly where you need to be." Merritt looked down at his feet. The snow beneath him did look different, flatter and more uniform than the drifted powder between the trees. He stomped his boot, and the sound that came back was wrong. It was the hollow thud of ice rather than the solid resistance of frozen ground. "Lady, I don't know what kind of game this is, but I need to get back to my truck." "Your truck is being taken care of," she said. "By my friends. They're very interested in what you're hauling, Mr. Voss. Paper products, according to your manifest. But we both know that's not all you're carrying, is it?" Merritt felt his stomach drop. How did she know his name? And more importantly, how did she know about the second load? The woman saw his expression change and her smile widened. "Don't worry. We're not going to report you. We're not interested in your legal troubles or the arrangements you've made with certain distributors who operate outside normal channels. What we're interested in is establishing a business relationship, one that could be very profitable for everyone involved." Merritt's mind was racing. The second load, the one that wasn't on his manifest, was a private arrangement he'd made with a distributor in Ashland. Nothing illegal exactly, just some merchandise that was being moved off the books to avoid certain taxes and regulations. It was the kind of side deal that a lot of truckers made to supplement their income, and Merritt had been assured it was low risk. But now this woman in the middle of a blizzard somehow knew about it. And she was talking about business relationships while standing on a frozen lake that Merritt hadn't even realized he'd walked onto. "Who are you?" Merritt demanded. "My name is Hester Bloom. I live nearby at the old dark property on the southern shore of Spider Lake. My late husband used to run a tow yard there, recovery operations for vehicles that went through the ice or got stuck in winter conditions. Since his passing, I've been operating the yard with some associates who share my interest in the more profitable aspects of winter transportation." "You're talking about theft," Merritt said. "Hijacking trucks." "I'm talking about salvage," Hester corrected. When trucks get stuck on the ice, when they slide off the road in blizzards, when drivers abandon them in panic, those vehicles and their cargo become available to whoever can recover them. My associates and I have been salvaging winter losses for 3 years now. Very profitable work and completely untraceable when done properly. Merritt understood what she was really saying. This woman and her associates were using the winter conditions to steal trucks and cargo, probably targeting drivers who were hauling off-the-books merchandise that couldn't be reported stolen without incriminating the drivers themselves. It was a clever scheme, and Merritt realized with growing dread that he'd just walked into their trap. "I'm going back to my truck now," Merritt said firmly. "If you or your friends have touched it, I'll be reporting this to the police." Hester's expression didn't change. "You won't find your truck where you left it. And even if you do, you'll discover that certain parts have been removed. Battery terminals, fuel lines. Just enough to ensure you can't drive away until we've had a chance to negotiate properly. It's cold out here, Mr. Voss. Dangerous cold. And your phone has no signal this far into the woods. You're going to need help. And the only people who can provide that help are me and my associates." "This is kidnapping," Merritt said. "This is business," Hester replied. "And here's the deal. You give us the off-books cargo, along with a small percentage of your official load. In exchange, we repair your truck and give you detailed directions to a location where you can pick up replacement merchandise. You report that you encountered mechanical problems during the storm, lost some cargo to water damage or cold exposure, and delivered what you could. The insurance covers most of your loss. You collect your payment for the official delivery and everyone walks away happy. And if I refuse? Hester's smile finally faded. Then you try to find your way back to civilization in a blizzard, with temperatures dropping to -20 and wind chills that will kill you in under an hour. Maybe you make it. Maybe you don't. Either way, your truck and cargo become our property through salvage rights. But I'd prefer not to add another frozen trucker to the collection. Bad for business when bodies start turning up. Merritt was about to respond when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a mechanical noise, the grinding of metal on metal, coming from somewhere out on the lake. He turned toward the sound and saw lights in the distance, multiple vehicles moving across the ice. As they got closer, Merritt could make out their shapes. Trucks, at least 3 of them, being driven across the frozen surface of Spider Lake. One of the trucks looked familiar. It was his truck, his distinctive blue Peterbilt with the custom paint job he'd spent 3 months' earnings on. The truck was being driven by someone else, moving in formation with 2 other vehicles toward what Merritt now recognized as a low structure on the far shore. A building, barely visible through the storm, that had to be the tow yard Hester had mentioned. "You see?" Hester said softly. "Your truck is already ours. Now the only question is whether you want to make this easy or difficult. Easy means you walk to the yard with me. We conduct our business like professionals, and you're back on the road within 2 hours. Difficult means we leave you here to make your own way, and we sell your truck and cargo to buyers who won't ask questions about where it came from." Merritt felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm and think. He was outnumbered, stranded, and being strong-armed by people who clearly had experience with this kind of operation. Fighting back would accomplish nothing except possibly getting him hurt or killed. But if he played along, if he let them think he was cooperating, he might be able to find a way to turn the tables, or at least gather enough information to bring the authorities down on this operation later. "Fine," Merritt said. "Let's talk business. But I want my truck back in perfect condition, and I want compensation for the merchandise you're taking." Hester's smile returned. "Now you're being reasonable. Come on, the yard isn't far. We'll get you warmed up, work out the details, and have you back on the road before dawn." She turned and began walking across the ice, her lantern swinging in that same deliberate pattern. Merritt followed, keeping his eyes on the lights in the distance that marked the tow yard. As they walked, he noticed details that confirmed his worst suspicions. There were tire tracks in the snow, dozens of them, creating a network of routes across the frozen lake. The tracks suggested this wasn't an isolated operation, but a regular business, with vehicles crossing the ice frequently enough to create well-established paths. The wind was picking up, driving snow into Merritt's face with enough force to make it difficult to see. But through the blowing powder, he could make out more details of the yard they were approaching. It wasn't just a single building, but a complex of structures. A large garage, several smaller outbuildings, and what looked like rows of vehicles in various states of disassembly. Some of the vehicles were trucks, others were cars or SUVs, all of them presumably salvaged from winter conditions and being stripped for parts or cargo. As they got closer, Merritt could see people moving among the vehicles, working even in the middle of the blizzard. They were dressed in heavy winter gear, and they moved with the efficiency of professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. One man was using a cutting torch on the frame of a semi-trailer, sparks flying into the snow. Another was loading boxes from a truck bed onto a snowmobile-pulled sled. And standing near the main garage, watching Merritt and Hester approach, was a large man with a thick beard who radiated authority. "That's Linus Dark," Hester said, following Merritt's gaze. "He runs the mechanical side of our operation. Used to work as a legitimate tow operator before he realized there was more money in salvage. He's the one who disabled your truck, and he's the one who'll get it running again once we've reached an agreement." Linus Dark watched them approach with an expression that suggested he'd seen this scene play out many times before. New driver, led across the ice by Hester's lantern trick, arriving at the yard with a mix of anger and resignation. It was a system that clearly worked, and Merritt realized that he was just the latest in what was probably a long line of truckers who'd been forced into this same negotiation. "Welcome to Dark Salvage," Linus said as they reached the garage. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel in a mixer. "Let's get you inside and talk about how this is going to work." The garage was warmer than the outside, but still cold enough that Merritt could see his breath. The space was filled with equipment and parts, everything from engine blocks to stacks of tires to boxes of cargo that had clearly come from various trucks. Merritt could see shipping labels on some of the boxes, addresses from all over the Midwest, suggesting that Dark Salvage was operating on a much larger scale than he'd initially realized. Linus led them to a small office in the back of the garage, a cramped space with a desk, a space heater, and walls covered with maps of the local lakes and roads. The maps had marks on them, notations in different colors that Merritt couldn't decipher, but which clearly meant something to the people running this operation. "Here's how it works," Linus said, settling into the chair behind the desk. "You've got 2 loads on that truck. One official, one not. We're taking 70% of the unofficial load and 20% of the official. In exchange, we fix your truck, give you coordinates for a pickup location where you can get replacement merchandise to cover what we're taking, and provide you with documentation showing mechanical failure during the storm. Insurance pays out, you complete your delivery with minimal loss, and everybody's happy." "What if I refuse?" Merritt asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we take everything," Linus said simply. "Truck, cargo, personal belongings. We'll strip that Peterbilt down to the frame and sell the parts across 6 states. The cargo gets moved through our distribution network. And you get to explain to your company and your off-books contact how you lost an entire rig in a blizzard." Merritt looked at Hester, who was standing near the door with that same calm smile. "How many drivers have you done this to?" "Enough to make it a sustainable business model," she replied. "Though you'd be surprised how many drivers actually appreciate our arrangement once they understand it. We're solving a problem for them. They get to report losses that are covered by insurance. They maintain their delivery records, and they walk away with most of their cargo intact. It's better than the alternative. Which is what happens to drivers who try to fight back or report us to authorities," Linus said. "Let's just say that winter accidents are common in these parts, and it's very difficult to prove that someone forced your truck off the road or sabotaged your equipment when everything's covered in snow and ice." The threat was clear. Cooperate, or face consequences that might be fatal. Merritt had walked into a sophisticated criminal operation that had been running long enough to develop systems and protocols for every contingency. They'd lured him off the road, disabled his truck, and brought him to a location where he had no leverage and no immediate means of escape. But they'd also made a mistake. They'd brought him to their base of operations, shown him their setup, and revealed details about how they operated. If Merritt could find a way to survive the night and escape, he'd have information that could bring down the entire organization. He just needed to play along long enough to find an opportunity. "Fine," Merritt said. "I'll take your deal. But I want to be there when you unload my truck. I want to see exactly what you're taking and verify that you're not exceeding the percentages we agreed on." Linus and Hester exchanged a glance. After a moment, Linus nodded. "Fair enough. We're professionals, boss. We keep our word when drivers cooperate. Come on, I'll show you how we operate. Maybe you'll even be impressed." As they walked back out into the blizzard, Merritt looked around the yard, taking mental notes of everything he saw: the layout of the buildings, the number of people working, the types of vehicles being processed. He was gathering intelligence, building a case in his mind that he could take to the authorities once he got out of here. But as they approached his truck, which was now parked in one of the garage bays, Merritt noticed something that made his stomach clench. There were chains lying in the snow near the truck's trailer, heavy industrial chains that looked like they'd been dragged across the ice recently. And attached to one of the chains was something that made Merritt's skin crawl. It was a boot, a work boot, still containing what appeared to be a frozen foot. Merritt stopped walking and stared at the boot, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Linus followed his gaze and cursed under his breath. "Get that cleaned up," he barked at one of the workers. "I told you people to keep the evidence out of sight." The worker hurried over and kicked snow over the boot, hiding it from view. But Merritt had seen enough. This wasn't just a salvage operation. This was something much darker, something that involved more than just stealing cargo. "What the hell is going on here?" Merritt demanded. Hester stepped closer, her smile finally gone. "Mr. Voss, I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about the nature of our business, and about what happens to drivers who see things they shouldn't see." The expression on her face made it clear that Merritt's situation had just become much more dangerous than a simple hijacking. Linus Dark grabbed Merritt's arm with a grip that felt like a steel clamp. "Inside. Now. We need to talk somewhere private." Merritt found himself being steered back toward the office, Hester following close behind. The blizzard continued to rage around them, but the activity in the yard didn't slow down. Workers kept moving between vehicles, stripping parts and loading cargo as if discovering a severed foot in the snow was just another day at the office. Once inside, Linus shut the door and locked it. The small space heater in the corner did little to warm the room, but the walls at least blocked the howling wind. Merritt could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he faced the two people who now controlled his fate. "That boot," Merritt said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Whose was it?" Hester sat on the edge of the desk, her expression unreadable. "A driver who made poor choices. Someone who agreed to our arrangement and then decided he was going to report us to the authorities anyway. Linus discovered the betrayal before any real damage was done. You killed him." "We protected our operation," Linus said flatly. "This business only works if drivers understand that cooperation isn't optional. Most truckers are smart enough to take the deal and move on with their lives, but every now and then we get someone who thinks they're a hero. Someone who thinks they can take us down from the inside." Merritt's mind was racing. He'd walked into something far more dangerous than a simple hijacking operation. These people were killers, and they'd perfected a system that allowed them to operate with impunity in the isolated wilderness of northern Wisconsin. The blizzard, the frozen lake, the remote location, everything was designed to ensure that no one could escape or call for help. "How many?" Merritt asked quietly. "How many what? How many drivers have you killed?" Hester and Linus exchanged a glance. After a long moment, Hester spoke. "Does it matter? The past is the past, Mr. Voss. What matters now is the decision you're about to make. You can be smart, take our deal, and drive out of here with your life and most of your cargo. Or you can be stupid and end up like that driver whose boot you saw in the snow." "Those aren't the only options," Merritt said, surprising himself with his own boldness. "You could let me go, right now. Give me back my truck and let me drive away. I won't report this. I'll forget I ever saw this place." Linus laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You really think we'd believe that? You've seen our operation, our location, our faces. You know what we do here. The second you got cell signal, you'd be calling every law enforcement agency in the state. Then what's the point of this conversation? Merritt demanded. If you're going to kill me anyway, why not just get it over with? Because we don't want to kill you, Hester said, and her tone suggested she was telling the truth. Every dead driver is a risk, a body that might eventually be found, an investigation that might lead back to us. We've managed to avoid serious scrutiny for 3 years by keeping the body count low and the disappearances spread out. But we're not amateurs, and we're not sadists. We kill only when absolutely necessary. So, what are you offering? A partnership, Linus said. You've got a clean record, good reputation, access to routes and cargo that we can't touch without inside help. You could be valuable to us, Voss. More valuable as an asset than as a corpse. Merritt stared at them, trying to process what they were suggesting. They wanted to recruit him, turn him into an active participant in their operation rather than just another victim. It was a calculated move, offering him a way to survive while also ensuring his silence through complicity. What kind of partnership? Hester stood and moved to one of the maps on the wall. See these marks? Each one represents a successful salvage operation. Trucks we've recovered, cargo we've moved, drivers we've negotiated with. We've built a network across 3 states, but we need more information. We need to know which drivers are running off-books cargo, which routes they're taking, when they're most vulnerable. You want me to be an informant, Merritt said. We want you to be smart, Linus replied. You keep driving your routes, keep making your deliveries. But when you encounter other drivers who might be carrying valuable cargo, you pass that information to us. Simple phone calls, text messages with locations and timing. We handle the rest, and you get a percentage of every successful operation you help us with. And if I refuse, then we're back to the original problem, Hester said. A driver who knows too much and can't be trusted to stay quiet. We'd prefer not to go down that road, but we will if we have to. Merritt looked at the maps on the wall, at the dozens of marks indicating past operations. Each mark represented a driver who'd been forced into the same situation he was facing now. Some had probably cooperated, taking the deal and becoming part of the network. Others had refused and ended up like the driver whose frozen foot was still out there in the snow, attached to a chain like a piece of discarded evidence. He needed time, needed to find a way to turn this situation to his advantage, or at least survive long enough to find help. Playing along seemed like the only option. I want to see my truck first, Merritt said. Want to verify that it's actually in working condition and that you haven't stripped anything you're not supposed to take. Linus studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Come on. I'll show you what we've done. They walked back out into the blizzard, crossing the yard to the garage bay where Merritt's Peterbilt was parked. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Merritt could see that his truck had already been partially unloaded. Several pallets of paper products were stacked near the bay door, and workers were pulling more cargo from the trailer. But it was the second cargo area, the hidden compartment where Merritt had stashed the off-books merchandise, that drew his attention. The compartment had been expertly opened, and the contents were being sorted onto separate pallets. Electronics, mostly. High-end tablets and laptops that a distributor in Ashland was buying at below-market rates to resell through various channels. 70%, Linus said, gesturing to the sorting operation. Just like we agreed. You'll still have enough merchandise to complete your delivery and collect payment. We're taking the premium items, the stuff with the highest resale value, but leaving you with enough to maintain your cover story. Merritt watched as his cargo was systematically divided, his truck being plundered by professionals who'd clearly done this many times before. He felt a surge of anger, but pushed it down. Anger wouldn't help him now. He needed to stay calm, stay focused, and look for any opportunity to escape or turn the tables. "How long have you been running this operation?" Merritt asked, trying to keep his tone conversational. 3 years, Hester replied. She'd followed them to the garage and was now standing near the bay door, watching the work with what looked like pride. "Started small, just Linus and me, recovering vehicles that actually had gone through the ice or gotten stuck. Then we realized there was more money in creating those situations than waiting for them to happen naturally." "The lantern trick," Merritt said. "How many drivers have you lured off the road with that?" 37, Hester said without hesitation. Not all of them were carrying valuable cargo, and not all of them required permanent solutions. But enough of them have contributed to our success that we've been able to expand the operation significantly. 37 drivers. The number made Merritt's stomach turn. How many of them had cooperated? How many had ended up dead, their bodies hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness of northern Wisconsin? As if reading his thoughts, Linus spoke. "Most of them took the deal, Voss. Most of them realized that cooperation was better than the alternative. We've only had to eliminate 4 drivers in 3 years, 4 out of 37. Pretty good odds, if you think about it." "What happened to their trucks?" "Stripped and sold in pieces. Takes about 2 weeks to completely disassemble a semi and distribute the parts through our network. By the time anyone starts looking for a missing truck, it's already scattered across 6 states in forms that can't be traced back to the original vehicle." Merritt noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Near the back of the garage, partially hidden by stacks of tires, was a truck that looked like it was in the middle of being dismantled. The cab was up on blocks, and the engine had been removed. But what caught Merritt's attention was the paint color. It was a distinctive green, the exact same shade as a truck he'd seen at a rest area 2 weeks earlier. He'd talked to that driver, a younger guy named Marcus something, who'd been heading north to deliver mining equipment to a site near Hurley. Marcus had mentioned he was running behind schedule and was thinking about taking some back roads to save time. "That truck," Merritt said, pointing to the green cab. "How recent?" Linus followed his gaze. "Last week. Driver tried to run when he figured out what was happening. Made it about a mile across the ice before we caught up with him." He paused, watching Merritt's reaction. "He didn't take the deal. Fought back, tried to use his truck as a weapon. Linus had to put him down with a rifle shot through the windshield." The casual way Linus described the murder made Merritt's skin crawl. These people weren't just criminals, they were predators, and they developed a system that allowed them to hunt truckers with near impunity. "You're wondering if you knew him," Hester said softly. "If he was someone you'd met on the road, someone you'd shared a meal or a story with at a truck stop. That's what makes this business difficult sometimes. The trucking community is small, and there's always a chance you'll recognize your victims." "Is that supposed to make me feel better about working with you?" "It's supposed to make you understand the stakes," Hester replied. "This isn't a game, Mr. Voss. This is survival. The trucking industry is changing, margins are getting thinner, and drivers like us need to find alternative revenue streams. We've found one that works. The question is whether you're pragmatic enough to accept that and become part of it." A commotion near the garage entrance interrupted the conversation. One of the workers was shouting something about movement on the ice, about headlights approaching from the direction of the main road. Linus immediately moved to the bay door and pulled out a pair of binoculars, scanning the frozen lake through the blowing snow. "State Patrol," he said, his voice tight with tension. 2 vehicles, moving slow, probably doing a storm check on the county roads. "They won't come across the ice," Hester said, but her confident tone had a hint of worry. "Nobody official crosses during blizzards. They'll stay on the road." "Unless they're looking for something," Linus said. "Or someone." He turned to look at Merritt. Did you tell anyone you were stopping? Did you call in your location before following that lantern? Merritt's mind raced. He had sent that text to his dispatcher, a brief message saying he was investigating a possible stranded motorist. If the dispatcher had grown concerned when Merritt didn't check in again, they might have contacted authorities. And if the state patrol was out here looking for him, I sent a text, Merritt admitted, before I left my truck. But I didn't give specific coordinates, just said I was on County Road FEF. Linus cursed and turned to the workers. Kill the lights, all of them, and get everyone inside the buildings, now. The yard went dark in seconds, the fluorescent lights shutting off and leaving only the dim glow from the building's windows. Workers scrambled to get under cover, and Merritt could hear engines being shut off throughout the complex. Within 2 minutes, the entire operation had gone silent, invisible in the storm. Through the garage bay door, Merritt could see the headlights on the lake, 2 sets of them moving parallel to the shore. The patrol vehicles were indeed moving slowly, their searchlights sweeping across the ice and the tree line. They were looking for something, probably a disabled truck or a stranded motorist. They were looking for him. Merritt made a decision. This was his chance, possibly his only chance. If he could get the patrol's attention, if he could signal them somehow, they might investigate and discover what was happening here. It would mean blowing his cover, revealing to Linus and Hester that he had no intention of cooperating. But if the alternative was becoming part of their operation, or ending up dead in the snow, it was a risk worth taking. He took a step toward the bay door, intending to run out into the open and wave down the patrol vehicles. But before he could take a second step, something hard pressed against the back of his head. A gun barrel. "Don't even think about it," Linus said quietly. "Those officers are a quarter-mile away, across ice that might not support their vehicles if they try to approach. Even if you made it outside and started shouting, they'd never hear you over the wind. All you'd accomplish is forcing me to shoot you and spend the next week dealing with a body." Merritt froze. Through the bay door, he watched the patrol vehicles continue their slow circuit of the lake's perimeter. They were close, so close. But Linus was right. The distance, the storm, the frozen lake between them, all of it meant that escape was impossible. The patrol vehicles continued along the shore for several more minutes, their searchlights probing the darkness. Then, apparently satisfied that there was nothing to find, they turned and headed back toward the county road. Within 5 minutes, their headlights had disappeared completely, swallowed by the storm. Linus lowered the gun, but didn't holster it. "That was your test, Voss. That was your chance to show us whether you could be trusted, and you failed." "I was just watching them," Merritt protested. "I wasn't going to run." "You were thinking about it," Hester said. "We could see it in your posture, in the way you positioned yourself near the door. You were going to try to signal them, weren't you?" There was no point in denying it. "Yeah, I was." Linus and Hester exchanged a long look. Finally, Linus spoke. "We've got a problem. Can't let you go. Can't trust you to work with us. That leaves us with limited options." "You're going to kill me," Merritt said flatly. "We're going to make a decision based on practical considerations," Hester replied. "But first, we're going to show you something. Something that might help you understand why cooperation is in your best interest." She gestured for Merritt to follow, and with Linus's gun still trained on him, Merritt had no choice but to comply. They walked across the yard to one of the smaller outbuildings, a structure that looked like an old storage shed. Hester produced a key and unlocked the heavy padlock on the door. Inside, the shed was dark and cold, colder even than the outside air. Hester switched on a battery-powered lantern, and Merritt found himself looking at something that made his blood run cold. There were chains hanging from the ceiling, heavy industrial chains like the ones he'd seen in the snow. and attached to several of those chains were bodies. Frozen bodies, preserved by the cold, hanging like meat in a locker. Merritt counted 5 of them, all wearing clothes that suggested they'd been truckers. All of them showing signs of violence, gunshot wounds, trauma injuries, evidence of how they died. "This is what happens to drivers who don't cooperate," Linus said quietly. "We keep them here until spring, when the ice breaks up and we can weight them down and sink them in the deep parts of the lake. By the time anyone finds them, if they ever do, they'll be unidentifiable and impossible to connect to us." Merritt felt bile rise in his throat. The casual brutality of it, the methodical way these people had turned murder into a business process, was beyond anything he'd imagined. "Now you understand the stakes," Hester said. "We're not asking you to become a killer, Mr. Voss. We're just asking you to provide information, to help us identify targets and avoid law enforcement. It's a small price to pay for your life. And if I still refuse," Linus gestured to the hanging bodies, "then you join the collection. We add you to the chains, and in a few months you disappear into the lake. Your company reports you as a missing driver. Your family grieves, and eventually everyone moves on. Just another trucker who vanished in a winter storm." Merritt stared at the bodies, at the faces frozen in expressions of fear and pain. 5 drivers, 5 people who'd made the same mistake he'd made, following a lantern into the woods and finding themselves trapped in a nightmare. He thought about his family, about his wife and 2 kids back in Green Bay, thought about never seeing them again, about them spending the rest of their lives wondering what had happened to him, thought about his body hanging in this shed, waiting to be dumped in a lake like garbage. "I'll do it," Merritt said quietly. "I'll work with you. I'll provide information, help you identify targets, whatever you need." Hester studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Smart choice. But understand this, we'll be watching you. We have contacts throughout the trucking industry, people who can verify whether you're keeping your word. If we suspect you're planning to betray us, if we catch you talking to law enforcement or trying to warn other drivers, you'll end up right back here. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear." "Good." Linus holstered his gun. "Now, let's finish unloading your truck and get you back on the road. You've got a delivery to make, and we've got a business relationship to establish." As they walked back toward the garage, Merritt's mind was already working on a plan. He'd agreed to cooperate, but only to buy himself time. Once he was away from this place, once he had his truck back and was safely away from Linus and Hester, he'd find a way to bring them down. He'd contact the authorities, provide them with detailed information about the operation, and help them shut down this nightmare. But first, he had to survive the night, had to play the role of cooperative victim convincingly enough that Linus and Hester would let him leave. And he had to do it without thinking too much about the 5 bodies hanging in that shed, waiting for spring in the cold waters of Spider Lake. The unloading was completed within an hour. Merritt's truck was returned to him with the promised repairs, and his cargo was reduced by the agreed-upon percentages. Hester provided him with a cell phone number to use for passing along information, and Linus gave him detailed directions for navigating off the frozen lake and back to the main road. "Remember," Hester said as Merritt climbed into his cab, "we're watching, and we're patient. Don't make us regret letting you live." Merritt nodded and started his engine. As he drove away from dark salvage, following the tire tracks across the frozen lake, he kept checking his mirrors. Part of him expected them to change their minds, to come after him with guns and chains. But the yard receded into the storm behind him, and within minutes he was alone on the ice, following the route back toward civilization. It wasn't until he was back on County Road FF, heading north toward Ashland, that Merritt allowed himself to breathe. He'd survived. He'd escaped a nightmare that had claimed at least 9 other drivers, and he was alive. But he wasn't free. Not yet. Because Hester and Linus were right about one thing. They had contacts throughout the industry, and they'd be watching him. Any wrong move, any sign that he was planning to betray them, and he'd end up back at that salvage yard hanging from chains in a frozen shed. Merritt drove through the remainder of the storm in silence, his mind full of images he couldn't shake. The frozen bodies, the boot in the snow, the casual way Linus had described murdering drivers who didn't cooperate. He had to stop them. Had to find a way to bring them down without putting himself or his family at risk. But how? How do you fight people who have resources, connections, and no moral boundaries? Merritt didn't have answers yet. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was going to find a way. Even if it cost him everything, he was going to make sure that no other driver ended up hanging in that shed, waiting for spring. The storm was beginning to clear as Merritt reached the outskirts of Ashland. Through breaks in the clouds, he could see stars, cold and distant, beautiful and indifferent to the horrors that happened below them. Merritt had survived, but he'd also become something he never wanted to be, a witness to evil who was being forced into complicity to save his own life. And somewhere behind him, across frozen Spider Lake, Linus Dark and Hester Bloom were already planning their next operation, already watching the roads for the next trucker who would follow a lantern into the darkness. Merritt Voss completed his delivery to Ashland 3 hours late, citing mechanical issues and storm delays. The distribution center supervisor accepted his reduced cargo load without much question. Winter losses were common enough in northern Wisconsin, and Merritt's explanation about water damage to some of the electronics seemed plausible. He collected his payment, signed the delivery confirmation, and got back on the road before anyone could ask too many questions about the missing merchandise. But as he drove south toward Green Bay, Merritt couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen at Dark Salvage. The hanging bodies, the casual brutality, the systematic way Linus and Hester had turned murder into a business model. He'd agreed to cooperate, but every mile he put between himself and Spider Lake made that agreement feel more like a death sentence. They had his information, his routes, his contact details. They could reach him anywhere, and they had resources he couldn't match. Merritt needed help. Real help. From people who could actually do something about an operation like Dark Salvage. But going to the police felt impossible. Hester had been clear about their connections throughout the industry, and Merritt had no way of knowing if those connections extended into law enforcement. One wrong move, one conversation with the wrong officer, and Merritt could find himself right back at that salvage yard, this time as a permanent resident of the frozen shed. By the time Merritt reached the truck stop outside of Wausau, it was early morning, and he desperately needed sleep. But sleep felt dangerous now, like letting his guard down would give Linus and Hester time to change their minds about letting him live. Merritt parked his truck in a well-lit spot near the building and sat in his cab, watching other trucks come and go, wondering if any of those drivers knew about Dark Salvage, wondering if any of them had been approached with the same offer of partnership he'd received. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hope your delivery went well. Remember our arrangement. First information drop expected within 72 hours. Details to follow. H. Hester, already making contact, already asserting control." Merritt stared at the message, his hands shaking slightly. 72 hours. 3 days to provide them with information about other drivers, other trucks, other potential victims. The thought made him sick. Merritt deleted the message and climbed out of his truck. He needed coffee, needed food, and most of all, he needed to think clearly about his next move. The truck stop diner was half full of drivers starting their day or ending their night, and Merritt took a booth in the corner where he could watch the entrance. He was halfway through his first cup of coffee when a man slid into the seat across from him. The man was older, maybe in his late 50s, with the weathered face and calloused hands of someone who'd spent decades on the road. He wore a baseball cap with a faded trucking company logo, and his jacket had patches from routes all over the Midwest. "Merritt Voss," the man said quietly. It wasn't a question. Merritt's hand instinctively moved toward his pocket, toward the small knife he kept for emergencies. "Do I know you?" "No, but I know you. Saw your rig in the parking lot, saw the way you're sitting here watching everyone jumping at shadows. I know that look, son. It's the look of a driver who's just had an encounter with dark salvage." Merritt felt his blood run cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do, and lying about it doesn't help either of us." The man extended his hand. "Name's Harold Finch. Been driving these routes for 32 years, and I've been tracking Linus Stark and his operation for the last 2. Merritt didn't shake the offered hand. "If you're working with them—" "I'm not," Harold said firmly. "I'm trying to stop them, and I need your help to do it." "How do you even know I was there?" Harold pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open to a page covered with dates and names. "I keep records, every driver who goes missing in the Northern Territories, every suspicious mechanical failure, every cargo theft that doesn't quite add up. I've documented 17 cases in the past 2 years that I believe are connected to dark salvage. And last night, I was monitoring police scanner traffic when I heard about a state patrol unit checking on a possible stranded motorist on County Road FF near Spider Lake. When the patrol came up empty and I saw your truck show up here this morning, I put the pieces together." Merritt studied the older man, trying to decide if this was a trap. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I'm the only person who can help you," Harold said simply. "You think you can go to the police? Dark has at least 2 county deputies on his payroll, maybe more. You think you can just refuse to cooperate with him? He'll kill you and your family without losing a minute of sleep. Your only chance is to work with someone who understands how his operation works and knows how to bring it down without getting killed in the process. And that someone is you?" "That someone is us," Harold corrected. "There are 4 of us now. Drivers who've either escaped from Dark or survived encounters with his people. We've been building a case, collecting evidence, documenting everything we can about his operation. But we need more. We need someone who's actually been inside the compound, who's seen the setup, who can provide detailed testimony about what happens there." Merritt thought about the hanging bodies, about Linus's casual description of shooting a driver through the windshield. "What makes you think I survived my encounter? You're here, aren't you? Still breathing, still driving your rig. Darky doesn't let people walk away unless he thinks he can use them. So either you agreed to work with him, or you're smart enough to make him think you agreed while you plan your next move. And if I did agree to work with him?" Harold's expression hardened. "Then you're part of the problem, and this conversation is over. But I don't think that's who you are, Mr. Voss. I think you're scared, confused, and trying to figure out how to stay alive while doing the right thing. Am I wrong?" Merritt was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "He showed me bodies, 5 of them, hanging in a shed like meat. Said they were drivers who didn't cooperate." Harold's jaw tightened. 5. That's more than we knew about. We'd only confirmed 3 murders. He pulled out a pen and made a note in his book. "Did you get any identifying information? Faces, clothing, anything that could help us match them to missing persons reports?" "I didn't exactly have time to take inventory," Merritt said bitterly. "I was too busy trying not to become number 6. "I understand. But anything you can remember could be important. These drivers have families. people who deserved to know what happened to them. Merritt had closed his eyes and tried to recall details from that horrible shed. One of them was wearing a jacket with a company logo, red and white, some kind of freight company. Another had on a Green Bay Packers cap. The others, I don't know. It was dark, and I was trying not to look too closely. Harold wrote down every detail. This is good, this is useful. Now tell me everything else. The layout of the compound, how many people you saw working there, what kind of equipment they have, security measures, everything. For the next hour, Merritt described everything he'd witnessed at Dark Salvage. The garage bays, the vehicle storage area, the patterns in the snow showing regular traffic across the frozen lake, the maps on Hester's wall marking previous operations. Harold took meticulous notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. 37 drivers, Harold said when Merritt mentioned the number Hester had given. Jesus, we had no idea the scale was that large. We thought maybe a dozen at most. She said only 4 had been killed. The rest supposedly took the deal and either left or became informants. Or they're lying about the body count, Harold said grimly. 5 bodies in that shed, and probably more buried somewhere we haven't found yet. Dark isn't the kind of man who lets witnesses walk away, cooperation or not. My guess is that any driver who takes his deal ends up dead eventually, once they've outlived their usefulness. The thought made Merritt's stomach turn. He'd agreed to cooperate specifically to stay alive, but if Harold was right, that cooperation was just buying him time until Linus decided he was more of a liability than an asset. So what do I do? Merritt asked. I've got 72 hours to provide them with information about other drivers. If I don't, they'll know I'm not cooperating. If I do, I become complicit in whatever happens to those drivers. Harold thought for a moment. You give them information, but you give them information we control. Information about drivers who don't exist, routes that lead nowhere, cargo that's not really valuable. We feed them false intelligence, waste their time and resources, and use their own system against them. They'll figure it out eventually. Eventually, yes. But by then, we'll have enough evidence to bring them down. We've been working with a federal investigator, someone outside the local corruption network. He's been putting together a case based on the information we've provided, but he needs more. He needs solid evidence, eyewitness testimony, details that can only come from someone who's been inside the operation. You want me to testify. I want you to help us build a case that will put Linus Dark and Hester Bloom in prison for the rest of their lives. But more than that, I want you to help us find those bodies, give those families closure, and make sure no other driver ends up hanging in that shed. Merritt thought about his wife and kids, about the life he'd built over 9 years of honest trucking, thought about the risk of going up against people who had resources, connections, and a proven willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operation. But he also thought about those 5 bodies in the shed, about the driver whose frozen foot he'd seen in the snow, about the 37 drivers who'd been victimized by Dark Salvage. I'll do it, Merritt said. I'll help you build your case, but I need protection for my family. If Dark finds out I'm working against him, the federal investigator can arrange protective measures. Harold assured him. It won't be witness protection, not yet, but we can make sure your family is monitored and that any threats are dealt with immediately. You won't be alone in this, Merritt. There are 4 of us already, and we've got law enforcement backing, even if it's at the federal level rather than local. Harold pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. The card had a name: Special Agent Dennis Kolb, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and a phone number. Call him today, tell him everything you told me, with as much detail as you can remember. He'll want to meet with you in person, probably within the next few days. Until then, maintain your normal routine. Don't give Dark any reason to suspect you're planning something. What about the information drop? They want intelligence within 72 hours. Give them something that sounds legitimate but leads nowhere. Tell them about a driver who's actually working with us, someone we can use as bait. We'll set up a controlled situation where Dark tries to make a move, and we'll have law enforcement ready to intercept. It'll be risky, but it might give us the opportunity to catch them in the act. Merritt pocketed the business card and stood up. His coffee had gone cold, and the diner was starting to fill with the morning rush. How did you survive your encounter with Dark? Harold's expression grew dark. I didn't encounter Dark. I encountered what he left behind. 3 years ago, my brother disappeared while hauling a load through northern Wisconsin. State Patrol found his truck 2 weeks later, abandoned on a county road with no sign of my brother. Case went cold. Family gave up hope. But I knew something was wrong. Started investigating on my own, talking to other drivers, piecing together patterns. That's how I discovered Dark Salvage and what they were doing. Did you ever find your brother? No, but I found evidence that he'd crossed paths with Dark's operation. Found records of his route, found witnesses who saw his truck near Spider Lake. I believe he's one of the bodies we haven't recovered yet. Maybe in that shed you saw, maybe buried somewhere in the woods. But I'm going to find him, Merritt, and I'm going to make sure the people who killed him pay for what they've done. After Harold left, Merritt sat alone in the booth for another hour, drinking coffee and trying to process everything. He'd gone from being a victim to being a potential informant to being part of a larger investigation. The situation had escalated beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd followed that lantern into the woods. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Hester. Checking in, everything okay? You seem quiet. Remember, we're watching out for you. Stay safe. H. The casual tone, the false concern, made Merritt's skin crawl. She was checking to make sure he hadn't gone to the authorities, making sure he understood that they were monitoring him even when he was hundreds of miles away from Spider Lake. Merritt has typed a response. All good. Delivery completed, heading home for a few days. We'll have information for you when I'm back on the road. The reply came within seconds. Perfect. Looking forward to our continued partnership. Drive safe. Merritt deleted both messages and pulled out Agent Kolb's business card. It was time to make the call. Time to commit to the path he'd chosen. Time to start the process of bringing down Dark Salvage before anyone else ended up in that frozen shed. He stepped outside into the cold morning air and dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times before a professional male voice answered. Special Agent Kolb. Agent Kolb. My name is Merritt Voss. Harold Finch gave me your number. I need to talk to you about an operation in northern Wisconsin, about missing drivers and murder. There was a brief pause. Mr. Voss, where are you right now? Wausau, truck stop on Highway 51. Stay there. I can be in Wausau in 2 hours. Find somewhere private where we can talk. Somewhere inside with security cameras. Don't go back to your truck alone, and don't communicate with anyone connected to the operation you're reporting. Understood? Understood. Mr. Voss, you did the right thing making this call. We're going to keep you safe, and we're going to stop these people. I promise you that. After hanging up, Merritt went back inside the truck stop and found a table near the security desk where he could wait. 2 hours. 2 hours until he officially became an informant against one of the most dangerous operations in the Northern Territories. 2 hours until he put himself and possibly his family at risk in the name of justice. But as Merritt sat there, watching other drivers come and go, he thought about those 5 bodies hanging in the shed. Thought about Harold's brother, missing for 3 years. Thought about the 37 drivers who'd been victimized by Dark Salvage, and the unknown number who might still become victims if the operation wasn't stopped. He'd made the right choice. Even if it cost him everything, he'd made the right choice. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number, different from Hester's. Smart move calling the feds, but not smart enough. We know about Harold. We know about the investigation, and we know you're talking. See you soon, Voss. L. Merritt's blood turned to ice. Linus. Somehow, Linus knew about Harold, knew about Agent Kolb, knew about everything, which meant the operation was compromised, which meant Merritt's cover was blown, which meant... The lights in the truck stop flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in after a few seconds, but the main power was dead. Merritt stood up and moved toward the security desk where the guard was already on his radio calling for maintenance. Through the windows, Merritt could see the parking lot. His truck was still where he'd left it, but now there was another vehicle parked beside it. A tow truck with the familiar logo on the door. Dark, salvage, and recovery. And standing next to the tow truck, illuminated by the emergency lights, was Linus Dark. He was holding something in his hand, something that glinted in the dim light. Chains. Linus saw Merritt watching and smiled. Then he raised his other hand and pointed at Merritt, making a gun gesture with his fingers. The message was clear. You're mine. Merritt backed away from the windows, his heart hammering. Linus was here. Had followed him, or had been tipped off, or had somehow known exactly where Merritt would go after leaving Spider Lake. And now, with the power out and chaos in the truck stop, Linus was making his move. Merritt had two choices: run or fight. Running meant abandoning his truck, his livelihood, everything he'd worked for. Fighting meant facing a man who'd killed at least 5 drivers and had no moral boundaries. But there was a third option. Merritt pulled out his phone and quickly typed a text to Agent Kolb. Darkey is here. Truck stop in Wauso. He's coming for me. Send help now. Then Merritt turned to the security guard. Call the police. Tell them there's an armed man in the parking lot threatening drivers. Tell them it's an emergency. The guard looked skeptical, but picked up his radio and started making the call. Merritt moved to the back of the truck stop, looking for another exit, another way out that wouldn't put him face to face with Linus Dark and those chains. But as he reached the rear hallway, he saw movement through the back door's window. More figures moving through the parking lot towards the building. Hester was with them, along with at least 3 other people Merritt didn't recognize. They'd surrounded the building, cut the power, and now they were closing in. Merritt was trapped, and he had maybe 5 minutes before they came inside to collect him. 5 minutes to figure out how to survive the next hour. 5 minutes to become the first driver who'd ever escaped from dark salvage twice. The clock was ticking. Merritt Voss had 5 minutes, maybe less. The truck stop's emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly yellow glow, and through the windows he could see Linus Dark and his crew moving into position around the building. They weren't rushing, weren't showing any signs of urgency. They moved like professionals executing a well-rehearsed plan, cutting off exits and establishing control. The security guard was still on his radio, reporting the situation to local police. But Merritt had no illusions about how long it would take for help to arrive, or whether that help would even be legitimate. Hester had mentioned corrupt deputies, and there was no way to know if the responding officers would be working with Dark or against him. Merritt needed to think like a trucker, not a victim. He'd spent 9 years navigating problems on the road, finding solutions to mechanical failures and root complications. This was just another problem to solve. Just another situation that required quick thinking and decisive action. The truck stop had 3 exits. Front entrance, where Linus was positioned. Back door, where Hester and her crew were waiting. and the loading dock where delivery trucks dropped off supplies. The loading dock was the least obvious escape route, which meant it might be the least heavily guarded. Merritt moved through the building toward the loading area, trying to look casual despite the emergency lighting and the obvious tension in the air. Other drivers were starting to realize something was wrong, gathering near the front windows to watch the scene in the parking lot. The security guard was too focused on his radio to pay attention to where Merritt was going. The loading dock was accessed through a service corridor past the restaurant kitchen. Merritt pushed through the swinging doors and found himself in a commercial kitchen where a few confused cooks were trying to figure out why the power had gone out. He moved past them without explanation, through another set of doors, and into the loading area. The loading dock was a concrete platform about 4 feet above ground level, with a rolling door that was currently closed. Merritt could see the control panel for the door, but without power it was useless. However, there was a manual release chain hanging near the door frame, and Merritt grabbed it and pulled. The door began to rise with a grinding mechanical sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet. Merritt didn't wait for the door to open completely. As soon as there was enough clearance, he dropped down and rolled under the door, hitting the frozen pavement outside and coming up in a crouch. The loading area was on the side of the building that faced away from the main parking lot, and for a moment Merritt thought he might actually make it. Then he heard footsteps crunching through snow, and a voice called out, "Going somewhere, Voss?" It wasn't Linus or Hester. It was one of the other crew members, a younger man with the kind of face that suggested he enjoyed his work. He was holding a tire iron and moving to block the gap between the loading dock and a nearby delivery truck. Merritt didn't have time for a confrontation. He ran in the opposite direction, around the corner of the building toward where the 18-wheelers were parked. His truck was on the other side of the lot, but there were dozens of other rigs, and maybe he could lose his pursuer in the maze of trailers and cabs. Behind him, he heard the man shouting into a radio, "He's out! Loading dock, heading toward the truck lot." Merritt ran between 2 parked trailers and nearly collided with another figure emerging from the shadows. This one was older, heavier, and slower, but he was also carrying what looked like a handgun. Merritt changed direction without thinking, using the trailers as cover while more voices shouted in the darkness. The truck lot was a labyrinth of sleeping rigs, some with their engines running for heat, others dark and silent. Merritt weaved between them, trying to put distance between himself and his pursuers while also working toward where his Peterbilt was parked. He could hear at least 3 people following him, their boots crunching through ice and snow, their radios crackling with updates on his position. Merritt reached his truck and found exactly what he'd feared. The hood was up, and someone had been working on the engine. Battery cables were disconnected, hanging loose like severed arteries. Even if Merritt could get inside and lock the doors, he wouldn't be able to start the truck or call for help. "End of the line, Voss." Merritt turned to find Linus Stark standing 10 feet away, the chain still in his hand. Up close, in the harsh white light from a nearby lamppost, Linus looked less like a businessman and more like what he really was, a predator who'd found his prey. "You made this harder than it needed to be," Linus said conversationally. "Could have just taken the deal, fed us some information, lived your life. But no, you had to go and talk to Harold Finch, had to make that phone call to the FBI. Now you've created complications that I really don't appreciate." "How did you know?" Merritt asked, stalling for time. In the distance, he could hear sirens, which meant either help was coming or Dark's corrupt deputies were arriving to assist with his capture. "We've got people everywhere, Voss. Truck stops, dispatch centers, even inside law enforcement. You think a call to the FBI goes unnoticed? Agent Kolb's investigation has been on our radar for 6 months. We know everyone he's talked to, everyone who's feeding him information. Harold Finch's whole little network? We've been monitoring them since the beginning." "Then why let them continue?" Linus smiled. Because they're useful, they round up all the disgruntled drivers, the ones who escaped or survived encounters with our operation. They make them feel safe, make them think they're part of some big investigation, and then we know exactly who poses a threat to us. Makes cleanup so much easier when your enemies identify themselves. The implications made Merritt's stomach turn. Harold's network, the federal investigation, all of it might be compromised. The people Merritt had thought would help him might actually be leading him deeper into Dark's trap. "Harold's brother," Merritt said. "Did you kill him?" 3 years ago. One of our early operations. Before we refined the process, he fought back, damaged some equipment. Linus had to put him down." Dark gestured with the chains. "Harold's been chasing his brother's ghost ever since, gathering evidence, building his case, never knowing that we've been watching him the whole time, letting him think he's getting close to exposing us. You're insane. I'm practical. And right now, the practical thing is to clean up this mess you've created." Linus took a step forward. "You're coming back to Spider Lake with us. We're going to have a conversation about everyone you've talked to, everyone who knows about our operation. Then you're going to join your friends in the shed." Merritt looked around desperately for a weapon, an escape route, anything that might give him a chance. His eyes landed on a fire extinguisher mounted on the side of a nearby trailer, the kind that drivers kept for emergency situations. As Linus took another step forward, Merritt lunged for the extinguisher. His fingers closed around the handle and he yanked it free from its mounting bracket, spinning and squeezing the trigger in one motion. A blast of white powder exploded from the nozzle, catching Linus full in the face. Linus staggered backward, cursing and clawing at his eyes. Merritt didn't wait to see if the distraction would last. He ran, still holding the fire extinguisher, heading toward the far side of the truck lot where the perimeter fence met the tree line. Behind him, voices shouted and radios crackled. Someone fired a gunshot that pinged off a trailer to Merritt's left. Another shot hit the pavement near his feet, sending up a spray of ice and concrete chips. They weren't trying to kill him, not yet, but they were making it clear that he couldn't escape. Merritt reached the fence, a chain-link barrier about 8 feet high topped with barbed wire. Without thinking, he grabbed the fire extinguisher and hurled it over the fence, then started climbing. The metal links bit into his hands through his gloves, and the barbed wire tore at his jacket as he pulled himself over the top. He dropped to the other side, landing hard on frozen ground that knocked the wind out of him. For a moment he lay there gasping, hearing the sounds of pursuit getting closer. Then he forced himself to his feet, grabbed the fire extinguisher and ran into the woods. The forest was dense and dark, the trees creating a canopy that blocked most of the light from the truck stop. Merritt crashed through underbrush and snowdrifts, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his legs burning with effort. Behind him, he could hear Dark's crew hitting the fence, climbing over, spreading out to search for him. Merritt had no plan except to keep moving, to put distance between himself and his pursuers. But running blindly through winter woods at night was a good way to get lost, hypothermic or injured. He needed to find shelter, needed to find help, needed to... His foot caught on a hidden root and Merritt went down hard, sprawling face first into a snowdrift. As he pushed himself up, spitting out snow and trying to orient himself, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. It was the sound of chains dragging through snow, getting closer. Merritt scrambled behind a large pine tree and tried to control his breathing. Through the trees he could see lights moving, flashlight beams sweeping through the darkness as Dark's crew searched for him. They were maybe 50 yards away, moving methodically, covering ground in a coordinated pattern that suggested they'd done this before. The dragging sound continued, and Merritt realized with growing horror that it was coming from a different direction than the lights. Someone else was in the woods with him, Someone who was using chains the same way Linus had at the truck stop. Hunting him. Merritt stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, watching the flashlight beams move through the trees. The dragging sound was getting closer, and now he could hear footsteps crunching through snow. Someone was approaching his hiding spot from behind, moving slowly and deliberately. A hand grabbed Merritt's shoulder from behind, and he spun around with a shout, raising the fire extinguisher to defend himself. But it wasn't one of Dark's crew, it was Harold Finch. "Quiet," Harold hissed. "They'll hear you." "How did you—" "I followed you from the truck stop, saw Dark's people moving into position, and figured you'd need backup." Harold pulled Merritt deeper into the woods, away from the searching flashlights. "Agent Kolb is on his way with state police backup, but they're still 20 minutes out. We need to stay hidden until they arrive." "Dark knows about you," Merritt whispered urgently. "Knows about your network, about the FBI investigation. He said you've been compromised from the beginning." Harold's expression didn't change. "I know." "You know? Of course I know. You think I survived 2 years investigating these people by being careless?" Harold led them to a dense thicket where they could crouch hidden from view. "The network Dark thinks he's monitoring is exactly what we want him to see. Drivers who feed him false information, investigations that lead nowhere. The real work is happening at a different level, with different people. Agent Kolb isn't the only federal agent involved. There are 3 separate investigations running simultaneously, each one feeding the other's information while maintaining operational security. What Dark knows about is the decoy investigation. What he doesn't know about is the real case being built against him." Merritt felt a surge of hope. "So we're not walking into a trap?" "Oh, we're definitely walking into a trap," Harold said grimly. "Just not the one Dark thinks he's set. When he made his move on you at that truck stop, he exposed his operation to surveillance teams that have been waiting months for this kind of opportunity. Right now, federal agents are tracking every member of his crew, documenting everything they do. By the time this night is over, we'll have enough evidence to bring down not just Dark, but his entire network." The dragging sound came again, closer now. Through the trees, Merritt could see a figure moving toward their hiding spot. It was Linus, still carrying those chains, his face a mask of determination. He was maybe 20 feet away and closing. "Stay down," Harold whispered. "Let him pass." But Linus didn't pass. He stopped about 10 feet from their thicket and stood perfectly still, listening. After a long moment, he spoke into his radio. "I know you're close, Voss. Can feel it. You and whoever helped you escape. Might as well come out. You're not getting out of these woods alive anyway." Harold's hand had moved to his jacket, and Merritt saw with surprise that the older man was carrying a handgun. Harold had come prepared for more than just surveillance. "Last chance," Linus called out. "Come out now, and I promise it'll be quick. Make me hunt you down, and I'll make sure you suffer before you join the others in the shed." Harold raised his gun, aiming at Linus through the branches. But before he could fire, a voice called out from somewhere deeper in the woods. "Darky, State Police! Drop your weapon and put your hands on your head." The effect was immediate. Lights flooded the forest from multiple directions as law enforcement officers emerged from concealment. Merritt counted at least a dozen officers, all with weapons drawn, all converging on Linus's position. Linus looked around at the closing circle, his face twisting with rage. For a moment, Merritt thought he might fight, might try to take some of the officers down with him. But then Linus dropped the chains and raised his hands. "On your knees," one of the officers shouted. "Hands behind your head. Do it now." Linus complied, dropping to his knees in the snow, Within seconds, officers had swarmed his position, securing him with the handcuffs and reading him his rights. More officers were moving through the woods, calling out to other members of Dark's crew, ordering them to surrender. Harold stood up from the thicket, holstering his weapon. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." They walked back toward the truck stop, which was now surrounded by police vehicles with flashing lights. Merritt could see Hester being led away in handcuffs, along with the other crew members who'd participated in the ambush. More officers were securing the perimeter, documenting the scene, beginning what would clearly be a massive investigation. A man in a dark suit approached them, showing a badge. "Mr. Voss, I'm Special Agent Dennis Kolb. Are you injured?" Merritt shook his head, still trying to process everything that had happened. "I'm okay, but there are bodies. At Dark's compound on Spider Lake, 5 of them, maybe more, hanging in a shed. We know. We've had the compound under surveillance for 3 weeks. As soon as Dark left to come after you, we moved in with a warrant. We've already recovered the bodies and secured the premises." Kolb gestured toward the truck stop. "I need you to come with me and give a detailed statement. Everything you saw, everything you experienced. Your testimony is going to be crucial for prosecution." As they walked back to the truck stop, Merritt looked at Harold. "Your brother, did they find him?" Harold's expression was pained. "One of the 5 in the shed. Dental records confirmed it an hour ago. At least now I can bring him home, give him a proper burial." "I'm sorry. Don't be. You helped us stop them. Helped us make sure no other families have to go through what mine did." Harold extended his hand. "Thank you, Merritt, for having the courage to do the right thing even when it put you at risk." They shook hands, and Merritt felt some of the tension drain from his body. It was over. Dark was in custody, the bodies were being recovered, and the nightmare that had started with a lantern in the woods was finally ending. But as Agent Kolb led him toward one of the federal vehicles for transport, Merritt caught sight of something that made him pause. There was another tow truck parked at the far edge of the lot, partially hidden behind a trailer. It had the same dark salvage logo as the one Linus had arrived in, and standing beside it, watching the entire scene with an expression of cold calculation, was a woman Merritt didn't recognize. She was holding a phone to her ear, and as Merritt watched, she climbed into the tow truck and drove away, the vehicle disappearing into the night before any of the officers noticed. "Agent Kolb," Merritt said urgently. "There's another truck. Someone just left." "We saw it," Kolb said calmly. "We're tracking all vehicles associated with the operation. If anyone tries to run, they won't get far." But something in the agent's tone suggested he wasn't as confident as he claimed. And as Merritt looked back toward where the tow truck had disappeared, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really over. That Dark's operation was larger than anyone realized, with more people involved than had been captured tonight. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Merritt told Agent Kolb everything, describing the layout of the compound, the maps on Hester's wall, the systematic way they'd processed stolen trucks and cargo. He identified the bodies he'd seen in the shed and provided details about how Dark's crew had operated, both on the ice and in their follow-up surveillance. By the time he finished, it was late afternoon and Merritt was exhausted. Kolb arranged for a hotel room and protective security, explaining that Merritt would need to stay in the area for at least a few more days while federal prosecutors prepared their case. "What about my family?" Merritt asked. "Darke knew where I lived, who I was. If there are other people in his organization, we've already placed your family in protective custody," Kolb assured him. "They're safe, and they'll stay safe until we're certain all threats have been neutralized." Merritt should have felt relieved. The nightmare was over, his family was safe, and he'd helped bring down a criminal operation that had murdered at least 9 people. But as he lay in the hotel room that night, he couldn't stop thinking about that tow truck, about the woman who'd driven away while everyone's attention was focused on Linus and Hester. His phone rang. Unknown number. Merritt almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Hello? Mr. Voss. The voice was female, professional, and completely unfamiliar. My name is irrelevant. What's relevant is that you've caused some significant disruptions to a business operation that extends far beyond what you saw at Spider Lake. Linus Dark and Hester Bloom were valuable assets, but they were also ultimately expendable. The real operation continues. Who is this? Someone who wants you to understand that you're not as safe as Agent Kolb thinks you are. Someone who wants you to know that there are 17 other salvage operations across the Northern Territories, all connected, all profitable, all protected by networks that go deeper than state police or federal investigations can reach. You're lying. Am I? Ask Agent Kolb about the 3 federal witnesses who died under mysterious circumstances during previous investigations into trucking theft rings. Ask him about the state prosecutor who disappeared after filing charges against a salvage yard in Michigan. Ask him how many cases like this actually make it to trial and how many get quietly buried due to insufficient evidence. Merritt felt his stomach drop. What do you want? I want you to understand that tonight's arrests were expensive for us, but not fatal. We'll rebuild, recruit new operators, establish new compounds. And while we're doing that, we'll be watching you, Mr. Voss, watching your family, waiting to see if you testify and what happens afterward. The FBI is protecting us. The FBI can't protect you forever. Eventually, you'll go home. You'll return to normal life. You'll think you're safe. And that's when we'll make our decision about whether you're worth the trouble of eliminating or whether you've learned to keep your mouth shut. The line went dead. Merritt sat in the dark hotel room, his hands shaking, staring at his phone. He thought about calling Agent Kolb, reporting the threat. But something told him the agent already knew about the larger network, about the risks that remained even after tonight's arrests. Merritt had helped bring down Dark Salvage, but in doing so, he'd made himself a target of something bigger, something that operated across state lines and had resources that dwarfed anything Linus and Hester had commanded. He'd survived the immediate threat, but he'd also drawn the attention of people who played a much longer game. 3 weeks later, Merritt testified before a grand jury. His testimony, combined with evidence recovered from the Spider Lake compound and statements from other victims, resulted in indictments against Linus Dark, Hester Bloom, and 17 members of their crew. The case made national news, exposing a criminal enterprise that had operated for years in the northern wilderness. But 3 other salvage operations across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota remained untouched. Federal investigators claimed insufficient evidence to move against them, despite similarities to the Dark case. And 2 key witnesses died in traffic accidents before they could testify about connections between various salvage yards. Merritt returned to trucking, but he never took loads through northern Wisconsin again. He varied his routes constantly, checked his truck multiple times per day for tracking devices or sabotage, and maintained a detailed security protocol that his wife called paranoid, but that Merritt knew was necessary. Because late at night, when he was driving through isolated areas, Merritt sometimes saw lights in the darkness. Lights that swung back and forth in deliberate patterns, like lanterns calling to him from the woods. And occasionally, when he checked his mirrors, he'd see a tow truck following at a distance, never getting close enough to identify, but always there, always watching. The woman from the phone call never contacted him again. But Merritt knew she was out there, along with others like her, running operations that continued to claim victims across the Northern Territories. The federal investigation had shut down Dark Salvage, but it hadn't stopped the larger network. And somewhere in the Wisconsin woods, on frozen lakes and abandoned roads, those lanterns still swung in the darkness, still called to drivers who were running late, who were looking for shortcuts, who thought they could save time by following a light into the trees. Merritt had escaped twice. He'd survived and helped bring killers to justice. But he'd also learned a truth that kept him awake on long night drives. Some operations are too large to completely destroy. Some networks run too deep to fully expose. All you can do is survive, stay vigilant, and pray you never see another lantern swinging in the woods. Because the chains are still waiting, and there's always room for one more driver in the sheds that hide in the northern wilderness.